of the session. Okay, in this next session, we will be talking about ground rules and how we will be working together as a task force.
No.
So sorry, go ahead.
Hang on one second. I need to do the report from executive session before you move on.
Yes, thanks for the reminder, Amy. Yes,
you're fine. Okay, so we are now out of executive session. The task force went into executive session to consider the item called lunch break, executive session for board training on legal topics, including the Open Meetings Law and Colorado Open Records Act. Discussion during the executive session was limited to those items and no formal action was taken.
Great, thank you, Amy. Okay, so as I was mentioning, during this session, we will be discussing ground rules and how we will be operating amongst each other. I will go ahead and get us started off in talking about these ground rules, and then we'll turn it over to Joel to discuss that in a little bit more detail and more specifically review the bylaws in more detail. Okay, so here you can see starting on page 9 of the bylaws document. And again, I point this out because if anybody wants to go through this on their own and use their own screen, they're more than welcome to, but this screen is being shared. In terms of how we are going to operate, first and foremost, I want to start off this section by just acknowledging that we have a wide variety of folks that are in this task force, and just emphasizing that we should be coming into this space assuming the best in one another. And with the different perspectives that we are bringing to the table, encouraging everyone to spend some time outside of your lane and being open to hearing new ideas and concepts, even if you may have an initial gut reaction that you're already in disagreement potentially with somebody. Please do keep an open mind. I feel like that'll be a key to us collaborating with each other. That said, I'll just go through here. As we are going through some of these bylaws and specifically this decision-making section, this is really an opportunity for us to have a dialogue around some of these items. These bylaws have been drafted by Environmental Justice Unit staff and are certainly open to feedback and amendable. So if there's anything you want to share, feel free to drop your thoughts, your comment in the chat, or raise your hand and come off mute to share any of your feedback. Okay, so regarding decision making and how we'll work together, task force members commit to listening to one another, respecting one another's views, and treating each other with respect. So this constitutes us listening to and understanding each other and not immediately responding or refuting to any point that a task force member is making. This will allow everyone to share their voice on the task force and ensure that they are being heard. We want to ensure that all task force members are participating in discussion. And so, while we do not want to be interrupting each other and we want to be respecting one another, especially for folks who are a little bit more soft-spoken or introverted, we do encourage you to please participate. Your voice is very valuable to us. Each of you have been appointed, hand-selected to be on this task force, and your perspectives and your views are highly valued. As I mentioned earlier, task force members will discuss ideas, not people, and this kind of goes into wanting to speak from the I perspective. Please do not make assumptions about other task force members. Task force members will treat everyone, including members of the public, with respect. That's pretty self-explanatory. Task force members will focus on the topics at hand. So please, if we're talking about something Don't jump to a different part of the agenda or bring in areas that might not be relevant. Task force members will talk about what they think, what they know and have experienced, and will let others do the same. Again, recognizing that we are coming from different walks of life. All of us have very different backgrounds, and we want to respect that. Task force members agree to not make harassing, threatening, hurtful, or vulgar comments about one another or members of the public during task force meetings or subcommittee meetings. And if a task force member violates the section of the bylaws, the chairperson may meet with them to discuss the matter. We will get into who the chairperson will potentially be and vice chair in the section following this one. The chairperson may also recommend other actions, including but not limited to recommending removal of the member of a member by the appointing authority if necessary and appropriate. Okay, in terms of how we will reach agreement, if possible, the task force will strive to reach consensus on recommendations, plan elements, and other matters that are included in the final report. In terms of voting, the task force will make formal decisions by voting. Any member of the task force may ask the chair to call a vote on any topic at any public task force meeting where a quorum is present. The task force may reach a decision about any topics through a formal vote. These matters include, but are not limited to, policy directions and content to include in the final report. A simple majority of task force members present is required for a vote to pass. A simple majority is defined as half of the voting members plus one, or 51% of the voting members when a quorum is present. Votes may be taken by show of hand or a roll call vote for yes or no from individual task force members. However, selection of officers requires a vote by secret ballot rather than a public roll call or show of hands. We're not planning to elect the chairperson during today's meeting. We will go over duties and nominations, but when we are ready to for those elections, like it says here, we will plan to do that over a secret ballot, meaning that you would just direct chat your vote. Members may abstain instead of voting yes or no on any given topic. So if that's something that you would desire, that's definitely allowed. The following types of votes require a 3/4 majority vote of task force members present: removal of an officer or amendment of these bylaws that we're going over right now. At the discretion of the chairperson, issues may be voted upon electronically if responses are received within 48 hours of the notification and in accordance with Colorado Open Meetings Law. If a task force member or members disagree with the outcome of a vote by the task force member about a matter related to the final report, the member may provide a minority report to be included in the final report. A minority report must have the support of at least 6 out of the 27 members of the task force, or 20%, to be included in the final report. A minority report may be no greater in length, measured by word count, than the section of the task force describing the approved vote of the task force majority on the same topic. So minority report cannot be longer than the final report. And lastly, a minority report will be clearly labeled as such in the final report. Okay, that covers our decision-making processes and how we will be working together. Any questions, comments, thoughts around this before I turn it over to Joel and we continue discussing specific bylaws? And I'll stop sharing so we can better see everybody. Does this all seem pretty straightforward? It sounds like no comments or feedback around these ground rules. Welcome any feedback from task force members. Okay, and then keeping in mind, thanks, John, keeping in mind that this is not the only time that you can provide feedback. If after reviewing this on your own time, and if there are things that bubble up for you, please do share with me or with the other environmental justice unit staff. Okay, so at this time, I will turn it over to Joel to lead us in a conversation about specific bylaws. Joel, do you want me to do a screen share, or will you do it from yours?
If you wouldn't mind screen sharing, that would be great. Thank you, Lumna.
Yeah, no problem. And do you want to, which page? Would you just like to start in Article 1?
Yeah, why don't you start just at the beginning?
Okay.
Great. And while Lumna is calling that up, I really would like to just encourage all of you to share your ideas and your views on these bylaws. They are your bylaws, right? So the idea is that we've come up with a draft of the bylaws as your staff. The Environmental Justice Unit is the staff of the task force. And so if there are any concepts or ideas or language in the bylaws that you think should change or be different, or you think that there's something that is left out that should have been included, please speak up. You can raise your hand during this meeting. I'll try to pause frequently for questions, or as Lumna said, you can always email us afterwards. Send your questions or ideas to Lumna, and then we will present the bylaws to you again in February and ask that you take a final vote during your next meeting in February. So our goal today is to really go over what's in there, start the conversation to set you up for a vote at the February meeting. One other thing I'll mention is that the bylaws are modeled after the bylaws of the Health Equity Commission. So Task Force Member Nusete, these probably look very familiar to you. Task Force Member Davis, and I apologize for the overlap that you'll be seeing some familiar concepts for the second time. So I'll start with Article 1, which is just the name of the task force, including the abbreviation. We will try to avoid using that abbreviation whenever possible, just to ensure everything is clear, especially for folks who don't speak English as their first language. But if you ever do see the letters E, J, A, T, F, that is an acronym for the task force. Moving on to Article 2, this is the mission. Lumna went over this with you earlier this morning, and this language is directly copied and pasted from the Environmental Justice Act. I would encourage you to read it and reflect on it often as a reminder of why we are all here. Moving on to Article 3, this is a list of the members of the task force. This was also copied and pasted directly from the Environmental Justice Act. I won't spend more time on it today because you all met each other already during the introductions this morning. But if you ever need a reminder of who everyone on the task force is and what your different roles are, you can always reference Article 3. Moving on to Article 4, these are the duties of the task force. These also come directly from the Environmental Justice Act. For the most part, the wording is just copy pasted verbatim. The law does create very specific duties for all of you that you should keep in mind. And note that Article 4D cross-references the separate scope of work document. And that document lists all of the subjects that the task force must address in your final report on November 14th of 2022. So Lumna, would you mind calling up? Oh, yes, Arthur, please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question regarding just kind of the procedures here. As this is an advisory group, not directly making policy, but advising on what policy should look like. How are we, it's kind of, and then we're producing this report. How are we gonna vote on the material in the report and who's writing it? Just want to understand, like, going through the voting section, there doesn't seem to be a clear, like, majority wins on an advisory statement, that sort of thing. Kind of want to talk through that aspect.
That is a great question. Thank you for asking. And it is why Lumna was running through the decision-making component. So what we as your staff have proposed is that for any concept to be included in the final report or any other decision of the task force, We recommend that you all try to reach consensus. We recognize consensus won't always be possible. And so if consensus doesn't happen, any recommendation or concept that goes into the report would be resolved by majority vote. However, if there are some people on the task force who disagree with that decision, we did include an option for minority reports to be included in the final report as well. So those would be something voted on by at least 6 members of the task force, though not a majority. That minority report could also be included in the final report. So that was what we proposed for the decision making, but ultimately all of it is up to you. So if you all think that there's a better way to go about it, we can. And then just before I call on you again, I'll quickly say that in terms of the drafting, I think we as your staff will most likely do the drafting for you, but obviously you all will get to review every word and edit it and provide feedback to make sure that we accurately captured your ideas. So yeah, do you have a follow-up question?
I do. What does consensus mean? Is that a simple majority? Is that a supermajority?
Yeah, so I think consensus would mean every person agrees. But again, we recognize that that might not happen. There are 27 of you, and you were chosen because you have a wide range of experiences and perspectives and backgrounds and areas of expertise. So if there's not full consensus, we would have a majority vote. So 51% is what we called out as the threshold in the bylaws. I think that would be 14 out of 27 members if I did my math right.
And again, keeping in mind that this is how we are presenting the ground rules to you. If folks in this task force want to do it another way, please do present, your ideas, because we're open. Tyson, looks like you have a question.
No, super quick. Just wanted to clarify on the majority. 14 to 27 would be if we had full 27 members, but we were not quite at 27, correct? I just wanted to clarify that.
That's right. Yeah, we're assuming that both of the tribal governments will appoint their representatives soon, and that the House Minority Leader will appoint a replacement for Commissioner Moreno in the near future. Great. Well, moving on then, I think Lubna did a good job of covering the sort of scope of work and the topics that you all are charged with addressing. And we'll also cover them a little more when we discuss subcommittees later. But does anyone have any other questions on the duties or else on the scope of work document, kind of listing all the different topics that the legislature charged you with addressing?
I have a question. So this applies to both the subcommittee, the work of the subcommittees, as well as the overall task force, right?
Yes, that's right. So what we've proposed is that there be 4 subcommittees, and we'll again have a whole section about them soon. Each subcommittee would address one of the components of the topics that the legislature told the task force to address. So sort of each subcommittee would come up with specific ideas and recommendations on those topics, and then bring them back to the full task force for a vote on the subcommittee's recommendation. So great question. Thank you for asking that. Any other questions while we're here? Right, I will move on to Article 5 then, which is responsibilities. Lubna covered these earlier in part, so I will not kind of go into quite as much detail, but again, I would encourage you to read them and provide us with feedback if you have any. This is the Environmental Justice Unit staff, our staff's attempt at coming up with what we believe should be your responsibilities in terms of attending meetings, adhering to department policies, not making individual statements that claim to be on behalf of the full task force, and reviewing materials in advance. But if there are any aspects of these that you think shouldn't be in there, or there's anything missing, please let us know. So any feedback or ideas or questions or comment on those responsibilities before we move on? Okay, I will move on to Article 6 then. You all are a very quiet group, but I certainly encourage you to ask questions or provide feedback. You know, we have a lot of time today because we did want to make sure we have time to get your feedback. So please don't be shy in asking us questions. So Article 6 covers officers, and we've set up a proposal for essentially 6 officers to start out with. One is a chairperson, one is a vice chairperson, and then one chairperson for each of the 4 subcommittees that we've proposed to start out with. The chairperson role we've proposed to be responsible for creating an agenda, presiding over meetings, and ensuring compliance with the bylaws. And the next section of the agenda, we're actually going to be requesting folks to nominate themselves for that chair role. And then we would recommend that you wait and take the vote on the chair and formally elect them at your February meeting, your next meeting, just so we don't expect you all to meet each other on Zoom one day and come up with your votes in the same day. You know, we want time to percolate, or if someone wants to nominate themselves after the fact, we'll have room for that. But just want to encourage you to start thinking if you might want to serve in that chair role. Obviously, it will require a little bit more time than just standard service, but it is an important role to sort of preside over the meetings and ensure that the task force stays on business and accomplishes the really ambitious goals that were set by the bylaws, that were set by the legislature in time. The next officer role to cover is the vice chair. So as sort of common for a vice role, this vice chairperson would take over if the chairperson is not present at a meeting, and so they would preside in the chair's absence. And then they would also provide a sounding board. They would provide advice or ideas or feedback to the chairperson to help them develop agendas or come up with thoughts about other documents like the final report. So it's designed to not just be someone who fills in the chair's absence, but also someone who can really provide some ideas and thoughts for the chairperson to work with. And then finally, we have proposed that each subcommittee have a chairperson. We would recommend that the subcommittees choose their chairperson at their first meeting. We obviously have a lot to do in not much time over the course of the next year. So we need to get those subcommittees up and running quickly. And the chairperson would have a similar role for the subcommittee as they do for the task force as a whole. So they would work on developing an agenda, presiding over the meeting, and then of course reporting back to the full task force about what happened during the subcommittee meeting, including any votes that the task force as a whole needs to take. So those are our proposals for officers. Again, we could have more or less or different officers. It is really up to all of you. So if you have thoughts or advice, let us know. Any questions or comments or feedback on that before we move on? Ian, go ahead.
I would just like to propose perhaps co-chair roles instead of chair and vice chair.
Thanks, Ian. We got a little bit of feedback, but I think I heard you saying that you're proposing co-chair roles rather than chair and vice chair. All right. Anyone else have thoughts on sort of pros and cons of that? Hilda, I know that you are a co-chair of the Health Equity Commission, which is a similar body in some ways. Do you have any thoughts about how that works or doesn't work in terms that you would maybe want to share with everyone?
Hi, folks. Yeah, I would say I believe the co-chair model has been very successful for us with the Health Equity Commission. Has been really great in order to be able to share duties, skills, and really spaces in which people have expertise and be able to lead the commission. So I'll definitely agree on that one.
Thank you. And anyone else have thoughts on co-chair versus chair and vice chair? Trisha, go ahead.
Not thoughts, Joel, thanks, but just maybe a little bit more understanding of how that model works. So does that, like, what are the responsibilities, or how do they work together? I think it sounds like a good idea, but just would want to make sure we all then understand how those folks operate. Yeah,
maybe, I should have it. how we have been able to work it out with the Health Equity Commission, it has been especially being able to develop agendas for the meeting, being able to connect with the staff at CDPHE, being able to arrange those adequately. Also, if somebody's missing and not being able to lead some of the meetings, there is somebody else to be able to back them up and being able to be that support agency. And as I mentioned, I think this shares skills and knowledge and being able to have people from different spaces that can be able to lead in those aspects and be able to create, I think, create greater consensus around the commission, especially to be able to make sure that individuals feel comfortable in this.
Thank you, Hilda.
May I add to that? To Hilda's point, because our commission consists of members of the governor's cabinet as well as community members that represent the geographic, ethnic, racial diversity of Colorado, having a co-chair that is part of the Polis cabinet as well as a co-chair that is a member of the community, I think helps to bring both voices into the planning and the work. And that's so important because we want all voices. We want to create space for all voices to just to add a finer point on what Hilda shared.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Hilda. Megan, I think I saw your hand up next.
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to add 2 cents that I really support the idea of co-chairs. I have a number of, external, internal groups to the state that have utilized co-chair roles, and I would encourage it not to be viewed as representation from different groups, of more just redundancy on responsibilities. If people are available to co-create an agenda, that's fantastic. If someone needs to take over 1 week and then someone else can take over, it just adds some, it extends the time that someone is able to serve in that role and cycle out and train the next person. When you have co-chairs, you have someone new step in and someone else exit, and you don't lose as much of the internal knowledge of what's going on. So it creates a really nice redundancy and effort.
Thanks, Megan. And Jonathan, I think I see your hand up next.
Yeah, I really like the idea. My question was more, I don't know if Amy's still on, and or other task forces that have utilized the co-chairs, but just given the kind of training that we just had, I didn't know if there was concern with having 2 task force members having to coordinate or not, or if there were kind of concerns that popped up in that world. So that was more my question. Was I don't know if Amy's on or worth kind of following up there.
I'm here. I don't have an immediate answer for that question, and since you guys aren't voting today, I'd love to take a little bit more time to think through it. Thanks for raising it.
Thanks, Amy. And that's a great question, Jonathan. I know some other boards do what they call, I think what do they call them? Just small meetings of their officers to kind of plan out the next meeting that are open to the public. So maybe that's an option, but thank you, Amy, for being our attorney and open to researching these questions so that we can have that option. So Megan, did you have another question that you wanted to ask? Okay. So Renee, I think I saw some questions from you in the chat. So, if I think as we discussed earlier, we're still investigating the question of whether we can pay stipends or otherwise compensate task force members who are not state or local government employees. So I think that the chairs would be some of you all, right? So it would kind of fall within that same umbrella once we get an answer to that question. Does that answer your question, Renee, or do you have a follow-up there?
That answers it. Thank you. Honestly, it's because I'm a nonprofit. I do not get paid for the spaces that we work in, for any type of civil engagement and all the stuff that we do. So honestly, just assessing the community members that are coming from this space too, and the amount of effort and work this really does take, that yeah, I would love to be a co-chair and invest that type of time and incentive in that space. But is it truly with equity at this time? I still got 2 kids right now too. So in this space, really understanding what it means to kind of envelop all of community to be engaged just as equally.
Thank you. That's a really important perspective, and it's why I think we're trying to figure that question out and get the funding. And I think also I had personally been thinking about the funding more in the form of like a per diem, per meeting compensation, just because that's what's offered for the advisory board. But I think it's a good reminder that as we assess our options and available budget, we should potentially think in terms of like an hourly compensation or some sort of compensation for someone like a co-chair or another officer who's doing work between the meetings. So that's really important feedback for us to get. Jaime, I think I saw your hand up. Did you have a question as well?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the co-chair question. That's why I put my hand back down. I guess I was wondering if maybe we should also consider a secretary to take minutes and kind of help keep task force documents and drive folder in order, or are those tasks that maybe CDPHE staff are going to be helping us out with?
I think we are planning to do that. So Lubna and I are, and Natalie and Rosario, we are your staff. We are hopefully very soon, like within maybe the next week, maybe 2 weeks, going to post a position for an admin assistant who will be available to really do a lot of that kind of secretarial, keeping track of documents work. I hope you all will help us spread the word about that job posting with your networks once it's up. However, it is up to you all. So if you think having a designated task force member as a secretary would be a good way to engage and get folks involved, we can certainly do that. It's really up to you all. Maybe if I can propose, could I call a quick straw poll on the co-chair question, and then maybe we can dive deeper into the secretary question? Does that sound okay? So maybe could you give a quick thumbs up or nod of your head if you like the idea of the co-chairs, and then we can build that into the bylaws. So, oh, Sheila, do you have a question? Sorry. Okay, right. So I see some thumbs up. Okay, that was most of all the task force members I could see on my screen. So I think we as staff can build that into the draft bylaws for you all to vote on at the next meeting. So thank you. Ian, did you have another comment maybe on the secretary question or another topic?
Yeah, yeah, I just wanted to respond to Jaime's. I think it's a kind of a good idea, Jaime, because there's a deep responsibility here for these people to be driving the conversation around translation and availability and the noticing requirements that I could see a task force member working alongside with the staff could be a good position, and it would help share some of the load that perhaps the co-chair would be having to have oversight over, and a secretary could do that work instead.
Great. I see some thumbs up. Any other thoughts, pros, con on the potential secretary role? Okay, well, maybe can I call another straw poll? Oh, Trisha, go ahead.
Oh, maybe just to add on to that, I think a model I have seen sometimes with boards who do have a secretary, the secretary may still rely like on the staff to draft like the summary or the minutes, but that then the secretary is maybe that kind of the first member of the board or this task force to kind of review those. And then, then the full task force would have a chance to review them and provide some input, but it can be a helpful role, for a secretary to kind of be a go-to person to make sure that kind of a summary is captured accurately.
Thanks, Trisha. That's great insight. Mira, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just sort of following up on that. I think the secretary is a great idea to work with the division staff administratively. I would suggest that the division staff or the administrative assistant draft the initial draft of the minutes, just because I think that for a task force member to take notes while participating actively in the discussion could be difficult. So, I'd sort of suggest that this not be a minute taking role, but rather a sort of working behind the scenes to both approve minutes as well as work on other administrative matters with the division.
That's a great idea, Mira, and agree. I've been taking notes while Lubna presents, and Natalie is currently taking notes. So thank you, Natalie. And we all want to make sure that you're able to fully participate in the meeting. That's a great recommendation. Robin, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Joel. I just wanted to make sure, and I apologize for my confusion. Are we talking about a secretary for the whole task force or one for each subcommittee? Because if it's for the whole task force, I don't want to presume that that secretary, by virtue of being secretary, would be attending every single subcommittee meeting, right? And so then wouldn't be doing the minutes for something like that. I just wanted to make sure I understood what we were extrapolating. Thank you.
That's a great friendly edit. Thank you, Robin. And that is personally what I envisioned when I heard Jaime's suggestion. Obviously, we as the Environmental Justice Unit staff will attend every subcommittee meeting and be able to take notes. So yeah, that would be my personal understanding. Tyson, go ahead. Sorry, I know you have a question in the chat too. Shoot, and I just muted you instead of muting myself. I'm sorry, please.
No worries, no worries. I just wanted to go back to what we straw polled last time in regards to having a co-chair. I just wanted to get the comment that I put in the chat was just, I wanted to get legal feedback on that, because the only concern that I have about that is slowing the process down by having to have public meetings just to make an agenda. That's the only concern I had. I think really a chair and a vice chair should almost collaborate like co-chairs anyways, just to make sure the meetings keep going. But I didn't want it to slow down the process of getting meetings established, booked, and agendas set.
Thank you, Tyson. That's a really great point. So we're lucky that we have Amy and Emily here listening to the discussion, and that they'll be able to provide us advice on sort of how that coordination could work in compliance with the open meetings law. And certainly if we find out that it would require, publicly noticing every meeting between those two folks or something that would unduly slow the process down, we as the environmental justice staff can come back to you with maybe multiple proposals for how that could work at the February meeting. Ilda, go ahead.
Yeah, and how the Health Equity Commission has been able to handle some of those has been that we have a monthly meeting that's pre-scheduled weeks ahead of time. And it's normally about, I believe it's like 2 weeks before our Health Equity Commission at large with the whole commission. And we're able to prepare the agenda, send it ahead of time. So with a pre-scheduled meeting, it can be posted 24 hours ahead of time. And it's constantly posted, it can be posted within the website, and it's an ongoing meeting that can be public. So that is a way that can be easily handled, but also, Amy, you're the lawyer.
I was wondering if you or Sheila would have an idea. Thank you, Ilda. That's why we're really lucky to have that cross-pollination between the Health Equity Commission and this board. Go ahead, Sheila.
But I think that I think Tyson raises an interesting point. I mean, the co-chairs meet with me and some other Office of Health Equity staff to plan the agenda. And I'm wondering if that is aligned with the Open Meetings Act, or whether or not we need to publish that we're having this planning meeting. I don't know. That's a great question.
Great. Well, we can, hopefully that is a question that, go ahead, Amy.
Business planning is different from public business. And so, in the sort of two-part test where it's people and the substance, if it's just business planning in other words, setting the agenda and as long as there isn't a discussion of the subject matter that will be on the agenda and say where you all are voting, you're in the clear to have that meeting without posting a notice.
Thank you so much, Amy. That's incredibly helpful. Great. So I want to make sure everyone saw Jaime's comment in the chat that he's suggesting. Well, Jaime, do you want to just bring that all to us about how the secretaries could work with the subcommittees?
Yes, I guess I was just proposing that we have a secretary for the whole task force, and then each subcommittee could elect their own separately if they decide that's something that would be helpful to them.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like various folks, Uni and Mira, agree in the chat. So maybe then, are we ready to take a quick straw poll on the idea of having that secretary concept be something that we build into the bylaws for you to vote on at the next meeting, with one secretary for the task force as a whole, and then the subcommittee is able to select their own secretary at their own purview? Well, maybe I'll just call a straw poll. So thumbs up if you support that idea. Great. I think I see a lot of thumbs in the air, which I think Lumina and I are trying to count, but I think that looks like a close to majority, at least, if not everybody. So we can go ahead and build that concept into the revised bylaws that we present to you for your vote at the February meeting. Any other thoughts or comments on officer roles before we move on to the next section of the bylaws?
There was a good question in the chat that was sent directly about how this task force will function before the next meeting. So will the draft bylaws be in effect, these draft bylaws be in effect for the next 2 months? Or, is the feedback we are providing going to go into effect immediately? So I think that's a good topic to talk about.
Yeah, well, the draft bylaws are not binding because you all have not voted to adopt them. We would certainly suggest following them because we think obviously you all have a lot of work to do, such that we can't wait to February to get started, right? So I think our recommendation is yes, that we do try to follow them as closely as possible until the next meeting. And certainly we can take the feedback that you're providing now and sort of assume it will be voted on, right? We can sort of assume we're moving towards a co-chair model, assume that we're moving towards a secretary model, and if we need to adjust later, we can. But yeah, does that answer the question for whoever asked it? Great. Okay, any other comments, questions, confusion, concerns about the officers before we move on to the next section? I really appreciate all the robust discussion and ideas here.
Joel, just a quick follow-up. Do we envision any of the subcommittees meeting prior to our February meeting of the whole task force?
We do, yes. Lumina and I have been talking about trying to have each of the subcommittees have their first meeting in maybe mid to late January, if possible. So we do anticipate those first couple meetings happening before February. All right, well, I will move on, but if anyone wants to come back to the officer questions, we certainly can. So we'll now go down to Article 7 of the bylaws, which covers administrative support and the role of the Environmental Justice Unit. So this talks about what our responsibilities are as your staff. So our roles include helping with scheduling, calendaring, and of course, providing public notice of task force meetings. We, and specifically Rosario, will provide translation and interpretation services to ensure that all task force materials and meetings are accessible in both English and Spanish. I would like to just take a pause to quickly give Rosario a Zoom round of applause for interpreting this whole meeting excellently, and also translating all of our written materials, including these very lengthy bylaws before the meeting. So thank you, Rosario. All right. Continuing on, another of our responsibilities is helping to develop meeting agendas. We will process reimbursements for expenses and then any stipends that we are able to provide. We'll help facilitate public comment during the meetings. We will, as we discussed earlier, take the first cut at drafting the final report based on your direction and then edit it based on your feedback. We will, of course, take careful notes on what you discuss during public meetings and try to get those ideas captured as best as possible in the actual draft. We will ensure that all of your meeting materials, as well as the final report and other documents are readily accessible from our website, the CDPHE website. We will, of course, this isn't written into the bylaws, but be here to support you if you have questions, concerns, thoughts, ideas. This is her whole job, is to support all of you in the advisory board. And I'm available too. Natalie's available. Rosario's available. We're here to support you. So any questions, comments, or feedback on that? Okay, well, then let's move on to the next section, Article 8. This goes over how you conduct your meetings. It identifies a quorum requirement. We have recommended 50% as a quorum, 14 out of 27 members. Some boards and commissions have a higher percentage, but just given how large your board is, we do suggest that sort of just bare 50% majority is the threshold. As we discussed in executive session, we recommend that you follow Robert's Rules of Order, but that's only a recommendation, and you can be more informal as circumstances allow. We may suggest some edits to that section of the bylaws prior to February, just to sort of capture best practices around ensuring that the Robert's Rules of Order and the formality don't trip us up unnecessarily, and that they don't interfere with us getting our work done. Article 7, Section 3 also provides important information about transparency. So if we can scroll down to the next section. As we discussed during the executive session earlier, you as the task force are subject to the Colorado Open Meetings Law, as well as the Colorado Open Records Act. And so this component of the bylaw recognizes that and sort of ensures that you all know that you have to adhere by those standards. Since we did spend a long time on that in executive session earlier, I won't go into more detail, but are there any questions or comments on these sections of the bylaws? Great. I appreciate everyone being patient with us going through this. It is really important that we get these details right, even if it's not as exciting as the substance of what you all will be working on. So Article 9 talks about how we make decisions together. It's decision making. So Lubna already covered this before I started, because it is really important that we have this as sort of a consensus. So nobody really had any questions or comments or concerns on Article 9 and how you all work together. Now that you all have had a little more time to think about it and the ideas have been bubbling around, do you all have questions or comments or ideas or thoughts, or do you see anything that's missing that you'd like to add? Arthur, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm kind of still struggling with the voting, with the simple majority to include content into the final report. I certainly appreciate the minority report aspect, but as this is an advisory board, I want to ensure that whatever we put into our final report moving forward, that not just this session, but other sessions are going to look at as kind of a document to look at and have as a resource. I just want to make sure that whatever is included there had the more than just a simple majority vote from this task force, that it's based in science, based in reality. Just want to make sure that I just feel like simple majorities work with rulemaking bodies and those actually creating policy. That is not what we're doing here. And so I just want to make sure that what we do include has the full support of the task force, or not the full, but maybe a super majority of the task force versus just a simple majority. I know that's not really a question, but a comment.
No, comments are welcome. This is your chance to discuss. Does anyone have thoughts on Arthur's suggestion?
Yeah, this is Ian. From the disproportionately impacted communities perspective, we are far outnumbered by those who come from industry and both government. And so I think a supermajority does put us in a disadvantage for recommendations moving forward, though that doesn't necessarily mean we can't all come to agreement. But I do think a majority empowers community members the most.
Thank you, Ian. Other thoughts, comments there? Robin, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, it's just a question in response to Ian's comment question, which I think is a good one, and not having any experience on a sort of task force like this before. I'm wondering if Joel, you or anybody else have an idea of how they handled it in sort of previous task forces. Like, I'm not saying that that's how we should, because we all know the goal here is to do better this time, but I'm just asking the question. I don't know, a super majority, the standard is like, so I'd appreciate some input if you have any.
Unfortunately, I don't personally know. I have also not really been a part of a task force like this in the past, but we have a lot of knowledge and expertise here. So if anyone does have that past experience, please feel free to speak up. And certainly it's a topic that we as staff can research prior to the February meeting and bring you back some answers. Renee, go ahead. I see your hand up.
One way that might help, but just from other spaces that I work in, especially in training for Ally and Accomplice, is understanding that we come from kind of a colonial paradigm where we favor economic benefits or certain predatory behaviors because we're used to capitalism. So being able to literally balance health and safety also as well, or certain aspects of disproportion, so that we can always check with equity, whether we're really walking with context of the communities that one, we're trying to encompass now and include, and also so that we can dismantle where there's been harmful or even just forms of erasure to not represent those communities at all. So being able to truly balance what is the health and safety as well, what the industry that's in these spaces too, and how is it going to be amplified or valid just as much as economic benefits when we go forward with any type of context, when we make rulemaking or just propose anything.
Thank you, Renee. And I think you probably saw in the chat, we heard from Rosario, she didn't quite catch all of that. So just a reminder to speak slowly and remember that it takes a little longer with an interpreter. Okay. Arthur, please go ahead. I see your hand up next.
Yeah, my experience with other task forces is that these reports, if they don't have the full support of those members, can go sit on a shelf and collect dust. And so I want the recommendations of this task force to be used and go forward. And I think that having recommendations content of a report that is a simple majority loses that gravitas. Having a report with minority reports and it kind of argues against itself may not be viewed as a source document for those who are trying to really create legislation in this world. And so while it might be a higher standard, I think it's an important higher standard to ensure that what's in there has really the full thrust of this task force and every member who's on here, who, once again, as you guys have pointed out, are appointed for a reason. And so that's my concern. I'm certainly not trying to, yeah. I understand that, yeah, Ian's point, but certainly I want to make sure that whatever final report we create is actually used and not argues against itself and then goes sits on the shelf somewhere.
Thank you, Arthur. Trisha, I see your hand up next.
Thanks. This is such a great conversation, and you guys are making really great points. And I guess I think it will be important for us to resolve this. guess I wanted to just make a comment, like how important to me that we don't skip past the goal of the task force, like trying to come to consensus first, right? And that the vote would hopefully be a backup, and only if we can't get there. Like, to me, I just think it's so important for us to go through these, this is just an example of going through the conversation and trying not to just quickly go to, like, let's vote and get in our corners, but really, like, let's try to see where other people are coming from, what are the goals, what are their pros and cons, and really trying to work on it. And again, we have to, we do need to have rules of operation, and if we can't get there, what are our votes? But I just didn't want to pass by the importance of that.
Thank you, Tricia. And that is what we as staff are here for, is to try to help facilitate those conversations however we can to get there. Sheila, please go ahead. Your hand up is up next.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what previous fellow task force members stated, and that's the need for an equity analysis. And the equity analysis needs to be central to the decision making. I mean, so that we don't lose sight of why we are here. So I don't know if that can be incorporated somehow into this at this point, but that the equity analysis has to be taken seriously.
Thanks, Sheila. That's a great point. And one of our proposals that we'll talk about for subcommittees later is having an entire subcommittee dedicated to that equity analysis question, because it is so central in the overall work that the legislature gave the task force to accomplish. So I don't know if that kind of responds to your thoughts, but it is something that we think deserves at least its own subcommittee, so that there is a lot of work that goes into developing that part of the final report.
I would just add that the equity analysis needs to be tied to decision making somehow. And I'm not sure what that would look like right now.
Thank you. It does. And I think actually one of the things the statute tells us to consider, or tells you all to consider, is what types of decisions should require an equity analysis. So for example, permits, rulemaking, potentially contested enforcement matters, or to use a lawyer term, adjudicatory proceedings. So I think that is very much within the scope of what you all are charged with making recommendations about. Does that kind of answer your question, Sheila? Or I see your hand is still up. I didn't want to move on. No, okay. Looks like a Zoom question. Gary, you're up next.
Thank you, Joel. So I have just a little bit of experience on this, sort of task force process, and I got the chance to serve on the Governor's Emergency Council, and the subcommittee I was assigned to was workforce, which had a number of folks appointed from the business community, as well as a number of folks that come from labor organizations. And so I think Arthur makes a good point on a report that's going to make recommendations. When we could find consensus agreements on things to include, I think they carried significant weight. One of the things that we tried to do, if we couldn't reach consensus on something to include in the report, we did include it as recommendations that didn't receive full consensus. And so at least, the whoever the report's intended to, in this case, it was the administration and some of the legislators, that those recommendations move forward, they could see them, and they could see that they didn't receive full consensus. So that at least that information got passed forward. But the items that we could reach full consensus on, I think Arthur made a good point that they do just carry a lot of weight. And so I think that's maybe the idea between the majority vote and a minority report. But if we move to consensus and items that didn't reach full consensus but had a number of folks from the task force making the recommendation, it could be something that's helpful.
Thank you. Gary, that's a really helpful model, and Lumna and I might follow up with you after this to learn more about how that process worked. Mira, I think I see you next.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to wholeheartedly agree with Sheila's earlier comments. I think, sort of the purpose of this task force is to represent the voices of disproportionately impacted communities that haven't historically had their voices heard in government. And I think that that can represent a departure from the way that government has historically worked in a lot of ways. And I think that maybe I completely understand the need not to have a report that is sort of littered with minority reports, and that, agree that that could take away from the credibility of this, of the final product. But at the same time, I think there does need to be space to put forth and have represented ideas in the report that may not be able to reach full consensus in this task force. And I'm not sure where that leaves us in terms of majority versus supermajority for including the recommendations, but just support the idea that this is intended to be a task force that represents sort of marginalized or minority voices in the state. So, just want to echo Sheila's comments on the equity analysis and in the recommendations that we put forward, and sort of echo the need to have sort of marginalized voices and minority voices heard in this.
Thank you, Mira. That's really helpful. And we're, as staff, taking notes on all of this feedback, and we really will do our best to come up with something that reflects all of these ideas, and maybe even multiple options for you all to vote on and consider during the February meeting when you adopt the bylaws. So, Michael, I think I see you next.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this dialogue, and I too want to echo what Sheila was talking about as far as really identifying this equity analysis, and even to Mira's point around how do we continue to have a safe space where we get the inclusion of all people who have been marginalized or have not been represented by their governments. But I do want to go back to Gary's point and Arthur's point, and I think the committee should follow up to ensure that when we're looking at this majority and minority reports, that people have perspective, right? And they have context. And that model that Gary was mentioning, it's just something that I think we should probably look into and incorporate some of those best practices. That's it.
Thank you, Michael. Jonathan, you are next. Sorry, Jonathan, I think we failed to make you co-host after you left and rejoined. So are you able to speak now?
Yeah, tech issues are always fun, but I appreciate it. Yeah, I just wanted to echo the idea that Gary put out. I think if there is a system that we can come up with that continues to drive, consensus, pushes us to get to consensus, but then also is not mutually exclusive to kind of noting, ideas that maybe only get, majority support or something like that. I just wanted to echo that. I think that sounds like a great idea to follow up on, and I would support looking at some type of model like that isn't mutually exclusive, but allows us to kind of seek consensus, but also note places where there was, maybe not full consensus, but still great ideas worth considering.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Michael, did you have something else? I see your hand is still up. Okay. Renee, you're up next.
Sorry, I didn't unmute. If we're going to do equity analysis, we need to see where we can be restorative to communities that have been impacted to start addressing disproportion, in all honesty, and how can we honestly, that's kind of what we're here for, is forms of restorative justice, so that we're not just analyzing or defining, but we're actually to have some form of equity implementation going forward for the communities that have already been impacted by a number of cumulative impacts, and then erasure.
Thank you, Renee. And again, I'll just say I agree, and so does the statute. So one of the topics that the Environmental Justice Act tells you all to address in the context of equity analysis is when and whether and how to consider cumulative impacts. So that is very much solidly within that equity analysis consideration for the subcommittee and for all of you. And it's great to think about restorative justice in that space as well. Ian, go ahead.
Well, I'm still just struggling with how best to convey the voices of the people that I work with every single day across the state of Colorado, where our vote is equal to those, the people in the government and industry who are present here. And yes, we're all here for a reason, but you know, it's a lot harder to count to 21 than it is to 14 for an idea that we may have. And I think our communities expect us to push for those. And yeah, I don't really know how best to express my words here, but I get the sense that if I were to go back and talk to my community about wanting consensus or supermajority, that they would perhaps feel disempowered because they feel like the cards are already stacked against them, despite the good and willful effort of everyone here.
Thank you, Ian. I think I see Arthur's hand up next.
Yeah, I mean, just to that point, Ian, I think we're all here representing our communities. That's the purpose of who we are. And so and there's public comment, right? We are all here to represent our communities, to bring that forward, to really create a document that is workable, that like someone else can take and use, right? Because that's what I know my communities want, that I represent, is something useful. And so what I'm scared about is creating a document that has all these ideas in them that once again kind of can be counterintuitive to one another, almost like talking out both sides of the report's mouth, if you will, that I want to create a powerful document that provides a roadmap to real change. And I think that can be watered down with a simple majority vote, because it doesn't have the direction of everyone from this task force pushing forward. That if we just decide that a simple majority is what concepts and ideas that can go into this report need, I think more stuff's going to be put in that then waters down the good ideas. That's my concern.
Thank you, Arthur. I think I see Tyson next.
Just a clarifying question that may help with some of this conversation. I mean, when the final report comes out, does the report say this was voted on by 14 to 13 in order to include in the report, or does it just say that this is part of the report and no background on the actual voting record? Because that makes a difference. I mean, if you're reading a report and exactly what that report is saying, you know, some people dissect numbers, some people look at the final report. I think we were tasked with coming up with the report, and that report will be read as such, and a minority report will be read as such. But I'm not sure if the voting record is like the headline of that report, and that may help in the clarifying of that.
I know that was a question, but I may turn that back as a question to you all, right? The law, the Environmental Justice Act, doesn't specify anything there. So it really is up to you all as the task force to decide how you want to handle that, whether you do want to include a vote count, whether you want to not include a vote count, but include a statement that says everything in here is by consensus or majority vote or 2/3 vote. Or if you don't want to say anything at all, I mean, it is your document to collectively decide how you want to shape it, as long as it's within the bounds set by the law. So go ahead, Ian. And then I think I see a couple of comments in the chat too.
Well, I'm just wondering if perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves by assuming what the political realities are and how the legislature and or commissions may take on the responsibility of the report. I do think we should bring that analysis when we make our choices, but I don't think that disproportionate impacted communities are so often told what the limits of possibility are and to temper our expectations. And so opportunities for us to put forward policy recommendations and then advocate for them thereafter perhaps changes the political possibilities. There were people who said we would never be able to change or alter SB 260, where we got an environmental justice division and $50 million in just 10 days. 1266 and SB 200 before it looked like it was dead in the water, but the advocacy of frontline members across the state of Colorado brought that policy forward. And so I guess I would hope that we would dream big and not temper a report here in hopes again of what Renee is talking about, drastically re-envisioning what is possible.
Thank you for that comment, Ian. And I think maybe that's a good time for me to put on my facilitator hat and move us along. I think that's a great closing statement. And I would encourage you to not put limits on yourselves. The task force has a really impressive and broad and important mandate from the General Assembly. And I encourage you to think about the possibilities and not the limits as much as possible. So with that, I think you all have given us as staff a really great set of concepts to work through. So I think we know what we need to do in terms of coming up with some amendments to the draft bylaws for you all to consider. As I said, we can even bring forth potentially multiple options for you to select from for important concepts like how you make decisions and how different concepts that you recommend are included in the final report, and we can bring those to you for your final decision in February. And then, if you have ideas between now and the February meeting, please share them with us. Lubna and I can both take your ideas. Lubna's job is to hear those ideas and make sure that we get them incorporated into the bylaws or later the report if it's a sort of policy concept like we've been talking about with the equity analysis. So please bring those ideas to us, and then hopefully we can get even more great discussion and then a decision about how we will make decisions for the February meeting when you adopt the bylaws. With that, I think I will move on to the next section, which is subcommittees. We have alluded to these multiple times, and we will talk about them more later this afternoon, but I would just want to give a brief overview of the process of the subcommittees. First, we do expect every task force member to sit on at least one subcommittee. So we will ask you all to be on at least one subcommittee. Second, as we discussed, we'll have a chairperson for the subcommittees, and Jaime's suggestion seems like it had a lot of traction of also having a secretary for each subcommittee. Hopefully those are roles that you all can select at your first meeting of each subcommittee. You all, as the task force, can create as many subcommittees as you want. However, we, the staff of the Environmental Justice Unit, came up with a recommendation of 4 different subcommittees that we think would be a good idea to start out with. And again, I'll discuss each of these in more detail at that point on the agenda. But broadly, those are: one dedicated to the equity analysis and the cumulative impacts analysis that could be part of that. Second, a committee dedicated to the definition of disproportionately impacted community. Third, a subcommittee dedicated to data and environmental health disparities. And fourth, a subcommittee dedicated to best practices for community engagement. So what we would recommend is that each subcommittee can make recommendations to the full task force about content to include in the final report that is relevant to the subject that each subcommittee is working on. However, that content to be included in the report would have to be voted on with whatever threshold you all identify by the full task force to be included in the final report. So are there any questions about that before I move on to the next section of the bylaws?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Sheila.
So some of these subcommittees are going to need the support of data scientists, environmental epidemiologists, et cetera, environmental toxicologists. I think I heard you say that that kind of support will be available. I just wanted to confirm though.
Yes, that is a great question. So we all, as the staff of the task force, are here to support you with research and policy matters. One of our next hires after the administrative assistant will actually be a data expert. We call them the environmental justice analyst. So that will be someone who can really help with a lot of the data questions. We did not get the fiscal budget to hire a toxicologist from the legislature. So we won't have an on-staff toxicologist within the environmental justice unit. But we are privileged to have a toxicologist on the task force, Uni. So Uni, I hope you will be available to help us with some of those questions. Then of course, CDPHE does have the toxicology and environmental epidemiology unit. I'm gonna pause there for Rosario to catch up. That was quite a mouthful. And we hope that the toxicology and environmental epidemiology unit may be able to provide some support as well. We can think about inviting perhaps Christy or Margaret or other experts on their staff to some of our subcommittee meetings. That's a great idea, Robin, but of course their availability will depend on their other priorities. The environmental justice unit staff, we are all dedicated full-time to working for you. The rest of CDPHE will just have to figure out how much time they can spend depending on their availability. Yilda, go ahead.
Yeah, hi folks. I'd like to probably emphasize the importance of having an epidemiologist outside of the task force. Especially, I think we have our internal connections to the industry that we work in, and especially for people to be able to trust a lot of those statements and a lot of those pieces, especially in toxicology, will be really important for us to have an external individual outside of the task force because we are voting members as well. So I would definitely like to emphasize that.
Thank you, Ilda. Yeah, we hope that as staff, we can provide some of that neutral standpoint. And we recognize that for many communities, there isn't full trust even in us as a government agency because of the history of systemic racism and structural racism and marginalization that so many communities have faced. I think something we could explore is if there is a need to hire an outside independent expert, even outside of the government or the task force, we could investigate if we could find funding for that on a case-by-case basis. So again, to Ian's point of keeping open possibilities, the answer might not always be yes, but if and when we encounter various needs that we might need to address, we can do our best to try to meet those needs. So no guarantee, outside experts, especially someone with expertise in toxicology, can be expensive and it would depend on the scope of work, but we'll do our best if and when those questions arise to investigate whether funding could be available for commissioning an outside expert or something. Ian, go ahead.
Well, I would just say that it sounds like a good idea. And I think what could be better than if an outside expert validated what the government toxicologist also said, right? That's a way of building that trust back to the government that many in my community just don't have. And whether that's founded in the personal behavior of a toxicologist, no, it's historical, like you're saying, Joel. And so if there's opportunities to use our resources to begin validating and rebuilding trust, that could be a huge win that's outside of recommendations that are being made to legislatures.
Thank you, Ian. Uni, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say I actually agree with this conversation. I know trust is not just given, it's earned. And what Ilda said about having somebody outside to validate what it is that we're doing and what it is that we found would be great. Reaching into CDPHE, I do, recognizing that they do have some toxicologists on staff and epidemiologists on staff could be extremely helpful. And, you know, again, it's just a matter of building trust within the communities that, you know, that it's their best interest. So I would support, you know, if you could put that on your priority to consider finding somebody outside of this whole conversation to kind of validate what it is that we're doing, whether it's through peer reviewing what it is that we've produced or something along those lines. That would be helpful.
Thank you, Uni. That's a great suggestion. So you have given us all a lot of, once again, good homework and follow-ups for staff to look into before the next meeting. So thank you. And I apologize that the male person just arrived at my house if you can hear the dog barking in the background. With that, if I don't see any other hands up, so I think I will move on to Article 11, which is about adopting and amending these bylaws. So what we have proposed is that the bylaws will take effect when you vote on them, which would be, we would propose at your February meeting. We suggested requiring at least a 75%, 3/4 vote in order to adopt them. And similarly, if you all would like to amend them after they're adopted, that would also require that supermajority 3/4 vote. So that I would open it up to any questions or comments on the sort of adopting and amending the sections of the bylaws or any other components of the bylaws. If anyone had thoughts that came up while we were talking about other sections that they did not get to raise. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. Again, Lubna and Natalie and Rosario and I, we're all here to answer questions or receive your feedback if you have any thoughts before February, but we'll take what we heard and try to incorporate them into a revised version of the bylaws for you all to vote on in February. I think that concludes my portion of the presentation on the bylaws. So I will turn it back over to Lubna, and I think, do we have a break next? Is that right?
We have a break scheduled for right after the next section. So I'm actually just going to briefly go over electing the chair or chairs. I'm just going to go back up here. Okay. So in this next section, I do just want to reiterate these officer roles. I know we've had a lot of conversation that kind of will be changing the language around this. But I do want to go over the responsibilities of the chair people. So if we do choose the co-chair model, which it sounded like there was a lot of interest in doing, these duties necessarily wouldn't change. Of course, anything can be added and can be changed, but in terms of the language as it is right now. So I will just briefly go over this once again. In terms of responsibilities, the chairperson would work with us, the Environmental Justice Unit staff, to develop and disseminate meeting agendas. They would be presiding over task force meetings, including formally convening the meeting, calling votes, maintaining order and adjourning meetings, representing the task force for official purposes, so external to being in this meeting, observing and enforcing the terms of the bylaws, and performing any other duties of the office as provided by these bylaws or established by the task force. We had originally talked about a vice chair, which again, if we are adopting the co-chair model, then the co-chair would be sharing responsibilities with another person. And so, you know, I won't go over these vice chair duties since that might not be applicable at this time. I do want to pause here and see if there are any nominations for the chair, for the co-chairs. If that is the model that we adopt, then I assume we would be electing 2 people. I do want to note that we plan to hold off on elections today. Since this information is brand new to us, and we are still considering which model we want to go, which model we want to enact, then perhaps electing a chair today might not be, it might be a little too soon. So we are proposing that we at least take nominations today and then do a vote in February. The vote that we are proposing is that folks would type into the chat as a direct message. So it's kind of a secret ballot. Any thoughts or feedback on that process? And if there's none, then we can start opening it up for nominations. And you can nominate yourself, you can nominate others, type in the chat, you can raise your hand and come off mute. All right, great.
Quick question.
I see a nomination for Ian.
Could
Megan?
you put the spreadsheet or the link to the spreadsheet of everyone who's on the task force back into the chat, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
I also had another quick question, and thank you for putting the spreadsheet. I think that's really helpful. And we're only voting for the task force, right? It's not for the subcommittees. That's going to happen at a further date.
Yes. So right now, our subcommittee section, after we finish this co-chairs section, we will break for a few minutes and then we'll get into more details about the subcommittees. Considering we don't know what the subcommittees will be, we obviously have come with a proposal of what we think those subcommittees should look like, but we're open to feedback. And so based on that, and once we do form the subcommittees, we imagine at the first subcommittee meeting, there would be a nomination and election process.
Whenever you get the chance, I have another process-oriented question, which is, since the members of this task force, I think, don't know each other very well yet, will there be the opportunity for nominees to give a statement either in this meeting or afterwards as to why they would like to be elected to this position, why they should be?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I would be happy to hear those thoughts from folks during this time. We have about a half an hour until our 3 p.m. Session on subcommittees in particular. So, you know, folks can definitely feel free to step up and share their perspective. And so far, it looks like we have nominations for Ian as well as Tyson. Ilda, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. Yeah, we have seen that for the Health Equity Commission, it was great to prepare kind of like a stump speech. It was able to elevate sort of the different areas that people want to elevate and how they want to work as a co-chair and kind of their way of leadership and management of different commissions or boards that they have been a part of. I will definitely recommend either, I think we did about a 3-minute stump speech as people were able to, before the voting.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think we can go ahead and with that. Jonathan?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I like the idea of some level of a stump speech or something like that. I think that's great. My other question is, just for clarity's sake, so is this the only time that you're taking nominations, or is there an opportunity for us to kind of look at the list, reach out and say, hey, I think this person would be great in between now and like a deadline, and then you would be able to like put together the ballot ahead of next, you know, the next meeting or something like that? I just I'm trying to understand exactly kind of what the timeline is here.
Yeah, for sure. The timeline definitely not just restricted to this meeting, which is why we are holding off on doing a vote for this meeting. Between now and February's meeting, we will be accepting nominations. Your point is a good one, Jonathan, about putting together a ballot. So if that's the case, I probably will have some sort of communication with a deadline, but it won't be soon. It'll probably be sometime in January at the earliest for a deadline for nominations. So folks still have a lot of time to review that list and kind of just mull over this and have until the end of the day to kind of get to know each other a little bit better. Mira, I think your hand was up before, and did I miss you before?
I've already spoken, thank you.
Okay. Ian?
I have a legal question about the ability to notice and have conversations between now and February in hopes of winning votes.
Sorry, what was the very last thing that you said?
Of earning votes, right? Because as Mira was making a case, we don't really know each other, everybody on this task force, and you run into that conversation, as I heard Jonathan asking. It's one thing to make a recommendation to staff, but if we are to be reaching out to staff via email, asking for their participation, is it possible for you to say, write a summary statement of why you believe you're the right person for this, and then share it to the staff to share with everyone else to avoid such problems?
Amy, did you want to speak to that? Or Emily?
Hang on one second. I was reading in the chat, so can somebody re-ask the question for me?
Yeah, Amy, maybe I'll try to paraphrase, which is that if someone wants to nominate themselves or someone else for a board position like co-chair, can they share biographical information or a statement about why they would like to be an officer in writing with staff, for staff to then circulate to all the other members of the task force prior to the next meeting, so that the task force members can come in informed with information about the folks who they're going to be voting on?
As long as it is just a sharing out of information, but there is no discussion that follows, and sending it occurs through BCC, which will prohibit folks from exercising the reflexive reply all, then I think we should be in the clear. So I was thinking out loud, so I'm going to repeat this to myself to make sure I'm cool with it. As long as you're just sharing information with the rest of the group, and maybe then make it available in the packet for the February meeting, then I think it should be acceptable.
So it sounds like if anyone has kind of a pitch or wants to share thoughts on why they should be elected to chair, you can share that information with me and I can go ahead and send it out.
Kind of
That's
building. Oh.
That's perfect. I'm sorry, just from a process standpoint, to have things sent to you all through Lubna, who will be good about BCCing and monitoring discussions. That's a perfect solution. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Beatriz?
We had our presentations earlier in the morning, but I think a bio of each individual that is also running for some of these positions would be really helpful, because I don't remember exactly where everybody works and kind of what if they've served in positions like this in the past as well. Like, all of this information would be really helpful to help us make a decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a reminder, I have asked folks to send me a short bio of yourself as well as a headshot. So if you haven't done that yet, please do send that to me. That is primarily for our website. and for members of the public to get to know you all, but also obviously will be a helpful tool for even task force members to get to know one another. That said, I don't want for people to have to craft their bios for the Environmental Justice Unit website based on their nomination. So if there's like a separate bio that you would like me to share with the task force, different from the one that you were sending me for the website, please do, and I can circulate that amongst this task force. Marcia.
I just wanted to, I don't know if this has been discussed. I noticed Tyson made a comment in the chat, and I just wanted to say that I'm in agreement with that one, just to keep things sort of leveled and fair within those committee roles. And there's representation from all.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Tyson, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I was just making that comment just from a public perception standpoint. I mean, the chairperson doesn't really guide anything, doesn't really push anything in any other way. It's more of an organizational piece. But, just like they do with voting, especially with what they've been doing with voting lately, making sure that, there's representatives from both sides. And this isn't even really a politically driven thing. It's more of a, hey, both sides had an opportunity to nominate people. Let's make sure that they're both represented in the chair and that all of the agendas went through them. That way there's no questions or concerns or pushback from them when the final report comes out.
And actually, just a quick point of clarification, if I may, Joel, yeah. Is that okay? Under Robert's Rules of Order, which you all in your bylaws have a draft that suggests you may rely on, the chair people are really, unless it is absolutely critically important to them, they are really designed to be facilitators of the discussion. It's unusual for them to make motions. It's unusual for them to second motions. So it is really a job where people actually step back from the policy-making approach in order to become the person who is seen as the steady hand on the tiller. Obviously, you're not full-fledged adopting Robert's Rules of Order, but it is really common for the chair, in order for the processes to be deemed as fair as possible, to really only weigh in when they feel really strongly about particular topics. So something for folks to consider who may self-nominate or for nominating others.
Thanks for that, Amy. Ian, I saw you had a question in the chat. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, my statement was in response to Tyson's suggestion that if we make the co-chair for those that were appointed, where does that leave a government staffer's ability to nominate themselves for a said role if they so chose?
I don't really have an answer to that. I imagine that it is up to the task force to kind of decide on what that would look like for government staffers. Joel, do you have any thoughts around that?
I don't. I think it's a good question. It looks like so far the folks who have self-nominated in chat aren't folks who are agency staff people. So maybe we won't actually encounter that question, but if any of you all who are nominated by the governor and our agency staff would like to serve in an officer role, then that is up to all of you to decide. And of course, remember, we do have 2 task force members who are not with us today, our tribal government representatives, so it'd be worth thinking about where they fit in as well. I'm very hopeful we will have them on board by our February meeting. So just food for thought there, but there's no restriction in any way, right, in the Environmental Justice Act. This is you all deciding how you want to work together.
Ian, go ahead.
Well, I just want to add, I think you make a critical point there, Joel. about Indigenous individuals being empowered in the state of Colorado to have a voice in driving the agenda, which so often they do not. And I guess just want to restate that I wouldn't want to set up rules that would leave someone from the staff from believing that they wouldn't have an opportunity to lead this conversation over the next 2 months simply because they weren't appointed that way.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And there was a question in the chat about how we will bring the people that are not present at this meeting up to date. Please do keep in mind that this meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be available in English and in Spanish. We will be putting that in this shared folder that everybody has access to. To be clear, members of the public will have access to these resources as well. To ensure transparency, we are taking kind of high-level meeting notes, which we will be sharing out at the beginning of the next meeting. And as I had one-on-ones with each of you, I will be having with the future members that will get appointed, and I'll do my best to catch them up. Ian, did you have something else?
This just dawned on me. Are we offering any resources to the tribal nations to assist in compensation of the translation of documents into Ute so that they can more easily make this information accessible to their people?
We haven't discussed that yet, but I think that's a really good point. And we can definitely look into the resources that we do have. If that is something that the tribal governments want, absolutely. We will work on doing that. Okay, I just wanted to provide a quick update that there have been 4 nominations so far, including for Ian, Tyson, Beatrice, and Renee. And we are continuing to take nominations, and you can do that after this meeting by emailing me directly and just letting me know. If there is a kind of a cutoff date for when we will be taking those nominations, we'll set that date amongst staff, and we'll send that out with ample notice, so you all have plenty of time to get your nominations in before then. If there are materials for those who are nominated or are self-nominating, if there are any materials that you want me to share with the task force members, please do send that to me directly. Of course, do not send in a group email. Okay, any other thoughts, questions, other nominations around the co-chair election? And thank you, Ian, I saw that in the chat. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions or any other feedback. So we will take a short break right now. And
Actually, Lubna, I'm sorry to interrupt. I wonder if we could also take nominations for secretary, since it seems like folks liked the idea of having the secretary role. It would be great to see if anyone's interested in serving in that capacity prior to the February meeting, so we can similarly distribute bios.
Yeah, absolutely. Any nominations for secretary, please drop those in the chat or come off mute if you would like to nominate or self-nominate. Okay, and keeping in mind that these nominations will continue to happen on a rolling basis. Yes, good point, Ian. It seems plausible that those running for co-chair may also run for the secretary position if they are not elected. Okay. Well, like I said, if any folks, even for the duration of this meeting, if it suddenly dawns on you that you definitely want to nominate somebody for a certain position, you can direct chat me or send me an email, and continue to do so in the coming days and weeks. I think this takes us into a break. Joel, is there anything you wanted to add before we hop off for a break?
No, just thank you all for remembering that we are being interpreted. Sorry, I went to the Spanish channel for a moment. You probably couldn't hear me. Just thank you all for remembering that we're working with an interpreter, and Rosario has caught almost everything you say, but just yet another reminder to speak slowly and clearly, especially if you don't have headphones, your sound quality might not be perfect. So we might miss a couple words, but so far I think everyone's been doing a really good job of remembering not to use acronyms, speaking slowly, and speaking clearly. So I hope that's helpful. And just, we won't always get every single word, but we're trying to do our best to make sure we do have a full-fledged Spanish recording and full access for everyone.
Yes, absolutely. And please note that nominations do not need to be done publicly. You can direct chat me, but I will be announcing who is nominated. And so anybody that wants to nominate privately, go ahead and direct chat me. Okay. That said, I think that'll take us into a break. Looks like we have about 12 minutes till 3. And so if we could break and return at 3 p.m. to join the subcommittee discussion. I think there'll be a lot of juicy conversations around, how we should form subcommittees and what they should be titled and all of that. So take a breather, clear your mind, and please come back with your productive hats on. All right, I'll break now. Thank you. Okay, I'll give folks a minute to get back. All right, so it looks like we have the majority of folks. If you are able, if you could just turn your camera on just to indicate that you are back at your desk. If you do need to turn it off later, that is okay, but just so we know that we have critical mass. Okay, great. And Joel, what would be most helpful? Do you want me to share the bylaws or the slide with the subcommittees on it?
Why don't you share the slide with the subcommittees on it? I think that's a good visual representation for everybody.
Great.
All right, so for the next component of the meeting, I'll just start to introduce it while Lumna is calling up the slide. We're going to talk in more detail about all the subcommittees. I'm going to talk a little bit about the substance of what each subcommittee will consider, as well as the time commitment and who is going to facilitate each subcommittee. As we discussed earlier, during the first meeting of each subcommittee, the subcommittee members will select a chair and I think also a secretary as well. And as we also discussed earlier, our proposal is for there to be 4 subcommittees. This is based on our own thoughts as the Environmental Justice Unit staff about how we think to best divide up the work. But ultimately, the decision is up to all of you all as task force members to decide how you want to configure the subcommittees, how many there should be, and what types of topics you think each should address. So the first subcommittee we propose is the Equity Analysis Subcommittee. This committee would be the most significant time commitment. We think that it would need to meet at least once every 3 weeks, so a little more frequently than once a month. Because it is the most work of any of the subcommittees, we would recommend that we try it on for size, that we test out whether it works to have it function as a single subcommittee, and then revisit later whether it needs to be split into 2 or more different subcommittees over time. The facilitator for the equity subcommittee will be Lumna, and the topics that it will address are many of the topics that are listed in the Environmental Justice Act. So first, it would address whether to require an equity analysis for certain types of agency decisions, what types of actions should require an equity analysis, and which agencies would be required to conduct the equity analysis. The subcommittee would also address whether to include cumulative impacts as part of the equity analysis, and whether to include avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating adverse impacts to disproportionately impacted communities as part of the equity analysis. Next, it would address whether the equity analysis should specifically include a requirement to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts for permitting decisions, even if there was not that type of requirement more broadly. And then finally, the subcommittee, as part of its work, will address 2 related topics, which are the definition of proposed state action in the definition of agency in the Environmental Justice Act. That is the relevant statutory, so legal language that would determine which agencies would be subject to the requirements of the equity analysis. So that was a lot of information. Any questions about that before I move on to talk about the next committee? Okay, so the next subcommittee that we propose is the Data and Health Disparities Committee. This committee would start out by meeting monthly, but could be scaled back to have less frequent meetings. We think it will probably be a medium to lower time commitment. The facilitator will again be Lubna, but she will be assisted by the Environmental Justice Research Analyst once we hire them. That is the data person that we mentioned earlier that will join our team in the near future. In terms of the substance of what this subcommittee will address, first, they will work on drafting a plan that addresses the lack of data and the lack of data sharing between state agencies about potential exposure to environmental hazards. They will also work to make recommendations about how to improve research and data collection efforts related to the health and the environment in disproportionately impacted communities. And finally, the subcommittee will develop recommendations for establishing measurable goals for reducing environmental health disparities for disproportionately impacted communities. So any questions about that subcommittee? Okay, the next subcommittee is the Best Practices for Community Engagement Subcommittee. It will meet monthly. We think that it has a probably medium level of time commitment, though it could have more frequent meetings, especially towards the beginning, because some of its recommendations might be considered by the Air Quality Control Commission in real time, as it's already conducting some of these best practices. The facilitator for this subcommittee will be Natalie. Natalie has been working with the Air Quality Control Commission to implement the practices to date that are already required by the law. And what this subcommittee is charged with is reviewing the best practices for community engagement that are identified by the Environmental Justice Act. Those requirements currently only apply to the Air Quality Control Commission, but the subcommittee can recommend whether some or all of those best practices should apply to other agencies besides the Air Quality Control Commission, as well as what types of agency decisions should require that type of enhanced outreach and community engagement. And of course, Natalie will make the information that she has compiled about how the implementation of these requirements has gone so far available to the subcommittee, and also come up with recommendations about how those practices can be improved in the future. Any other questions? Okay. And then next up, we have the definition of disproportionately impacted community subcommittee. This one will also be meeting about once a month. It will also be a medium level time commitment. It could potentially have more meetings during the first few months of the task force, with fewer meetings later in the year because of the timeline for Colorado EnviroScreen, which I'll talk about in a moment. I will be the facilitator for this subcommittee. And before I talk about the work that it will be doing, I'm going to provide a little more background about how the Environmental Justice Act defines disproportionately impacted community. So as Lubna mentioned earlier, the Environmental Justice Act has a three-part definition of disproportionately impacted community. The first part is a demographic component. It includes census block groups where more than 40% of the population is low income, housing cost burdened, or people of color. We've already mapped areas that meet this part of the definition with available census data. You can view them on the Climate Equity Data Viewer or on the data viewer for disproportionately impacted communities in Colorado. And I believe that Natalie will put that link in the chat so you can go look at that map yourself. The data viewer for disproportionately impacted communities shows why each census block group meets the definition, but we realize that it doesn't have the most user-friendly interface. So for a more user-friendly interface, you can also see the census block groups in the climate equity data viewer that is searchable by address. You have to click on the funnel icon in the top right to turn on the disproportionately impacted communities layer. Note that the climate equity data viewer does not show the reason why each census block group meets the definition. To see that, you have to use the data viewer for disproportionately impacted communities. And I believe that Natalie will also put the link to the climate equity data viewer in the chat. We are still working on maps that show the other two components of the definition of disproportionately impacted community. The second component of the definition is communities that have a history of environmental racism that is perpetuated through exclusionary laws and policies. Those include redlining, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Hispanic, and anti-immigrant laws. We have 2 interns who are currently conducting research to identify those areas, and they will have a final report ready for public review by the task force, by all of you, in May. The third component of the definition are communities where cumulative impacts contribute to persistent environmental health disparities. To identify those areas, we are using the new Colorado EnviroScreen tool, which is an interactive environmental justice mapping tool. Natalie will also put a link to the Colorado EnviroScreen in the chat momentarily. We are working with contractors at Colorado State University to develop Colorado EnviroScreen based on input that we've received from community members and other important stakeholders during the fall. We plan to open the tool for a limited round 1 beta testing in February, with public beta testing in April, and it will be finalized by June of 2022. So what that means for the subcommittee is that the first few meetings of the subcommittee will focus on beta testing Colorado EnviroScreen. Then, when our intern's report is ready, the subcommittee will review and provide feedback on that report. And then finally, the committee will review all the areas that meet the current definition of disproportionately impacted community and recommend whether any changes are needed, as well as whether the same definition of disproportionately impacted community should apply to other agencies besides CDPHE. There are currently multiple different definitions that apply to different agencies, and one of the things that you all will consider as the task force is whether there should be a single definition. So with that, I will pause and see if you have any questions. I know that was a lot of information again, and I'm happy to answer those as they come up. I wasn't looking at the chat as I spoke. I apologize.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Just in kind of evaluating how to participate here, when you all are saying medium time commitment for some of these or more time commitment for others, is that just based solely kind of on the frequency of meeting or, you know, the additional work? And are you all looking at, as we're looking at this, assuming each one of us will kind of join like a couple, or I don't know how the math works out with like number of people and like how we should be thinking about it, considering it kind of in evaluating like number of stakeholder or number of subcommittees to join and things like that.
So our recommendation is that each of you serve on at least one subcommittee. I think we anticipated it would be only one, but if someone has the time and desire to spend on to participate in more than one subcommittee, I think we would welcome that. In terms of what we mean by the time commitment, a medium time commitment is meeting once a month. A more frequent or higher time commitment, for example, the equity subcommittee might be meeting, say, every 3 weeks. And then for example, the definitions or data subcommittee, if there isn't a need for as frequent of meetings. So all the work is done and there's no need to continue meeting as often, it could go to bi-monthly every 2 months later in the year. Does that answer your question, Jonathan? Any other questions? I know that was a lot of information, so Lumna and I can try to create more of a visual or a diagram to follow up with you all to kind of display it more clearly. Beatrice, go ahead.
Yeah, Joel, I think that would be a great idea. And then also just kind of mentioning, you said the equity analysis subcommittee definitely has a lot more responsibility. And you said that it might be a good idea to split it in two. Does it make sense to start as two and then maybe come together like in a future date? So then that way the work is more evenly distributed across all these different committees versus putting a lot of burden on one of the committees.
We thought a lot about that and we'd welcome your feedback. I think where we landed as your staff is that it was really hard to figure out how to divide that up anyway. Each of the different parts of the equity analysis are so tied together that it was really difficult for us to understand how to cleanly break it up. So that is why we're recommending starting with one subcommittee that just meets a little more often to deal with it. But if anyone has ideas for how we could divide it out, we could certainly do that. I think just as an example, if we carved off the cumulative impacts part, it's really hard to figure out how cumulative impacts analysis would go if you don't know which agencies are conducting an equity analysis and for what types of decisions. So similarly, it's hard to carve off who does the analysis and when without thinking about the substance of should it include cumulative impacts, should it include whether to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts. So that was why we kept it as one giant group, but we are not the only people with ideas. So if anyone has ideas on how that could work better, we are very open to it. Jaime, go ahead.
Sorry if I missed something, but are there like written descriptions of these subcommittees available to us, possibly in the drive somewhere or something that I'm missing? Like you said, Joel, that was a lot. And yeah, it'd be nice if we had some descriptions available to us.
I think right now the only written descriptions on the drive are the slide that Lumna is presenting now, and then the very short just name of each subcommittee in the draft bylaws. So we can work on creating a document that has more information and is maybe a little more visual to share with you. Because yeah, that was, I'll just admit that I am a very auditory verbal learner, and I often forget to get a good mix of things for visual learners and folks who kind of want something more hands-on. So thank you for that feedback. We always are open to ideas about how to get the information out better. Okay, so I don't see any other questions. As a next step, we thought about seeing that if folks are ready to volunteer to serve on specific subcommittees today. I do want to take your temperature on that about whether you feel ready to volunteer or if you'd like a little more time. We do want the subcommittees to start meeting soon. So if we give you more time, it will probably be till just the first week of January, but just kind of want to maybe thumbs up if you feel ready to volunteer for a subcommittee today. I see 0 thumbs up. So, oh, Sheila is ready. Thank you, Sheila. Given that, maybe we can just ask folks to take a little bit of time to think about it. And Lubna, if people want to get back to you, what date do we need? I think January 7th.
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to think of kind of what would be the best way to do this. And I think maybe creating like a visual, like a table of some sort that goes through what we imagine each subcommittee will work on, the frequency with which we'll meet, and who the facilitators are. I can put that together and send that out. I'm trying to be careful about like open meetings stuff, but I'm trying to think about like how people can sign up. And I wonder if, you know, folks should just email me directly with their selections. I don't think that we'll be able to create like any sort of public form, right, where people are signing up and like in a shared document.
Amy, do you want to answer that question about the shared document?
Yeah, those kinds of procedural questions are okay, and as long as you're not making any decisions that folks won't learn the result of later, then I think you should be okay. So I think people can nominate. I think you can share a little bit more information about the subcommittees. If you share that information, then maybe just add it to the packet for the next meeting. So any kind of write-up that you do for the subcommittees, if you share out, then you should be fine.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead, Joel.
Oh, I was just going to call on Renee. Her hand was up, but did you have another thought, Lubna?
No, I'll think about it and share after Renee.
Okay, go ahead, Renee.
Thank you. Is there a way to kind of address the intersectionality of some of the subcommittees? Like for disproportionately impacted community definition committee, you're going to need the community engagement subcommittee because we already, again, have so many disparities about how we document community and how we even have outreach to community, and then to have that data included as well. For equity analysis and for data, again, there's already trauma sensitivity and language barriers, many different barriers that when we try to really unwind how we're going to tackle equity, they all kind of intersect. So I was wondering, I would love to be a part of certain aspects of each. And how would we be able to influence in that way, but have predominantly, if it's equity analysis that we're focusing on, how are we able to kind of just distribute some type of, I don't know, information to each other in that way? Or will that be addressed throughout the process too?
Yeah, well, those are great points, and we don't have all the answers yet, which I know I've said a lot, but I think we're listening to those ideas and thinking. And one thing I would encourage is for all of you to consider joining a subcommittee that's maybe a little outside an area that you normally work in. So if you think a lot about community engagement, think about the data committee and what you could bring to that table. Or if you do, you know, if you are already really, really familiar with our mapping processes for disproportionately impacted communities, we would love to have you on that subcommittee, but maybe you can find time in your schedule to join the equity analysis committee and kind of have that lens in the work. So I would encourage you all to think about that. Trisha, that's a great suggestion that the subcommittee chairs could do a debrief at the full bi-monthly meetings of the task force, bring back what that subcommittee is thinking about. And then of course, all of the subcommittees will ultimately be making recommendations about what to include in the report to the full task force, and all of you as the full task force will get to weigh in on that. So all of the different subcommittees are definitely related, and there's overlap. And if there's a way to break them up better, we're open to it. We just know that if we try to have all 27 of you somehow work through all of the details in our public meetings, we just won't be able to get it all done. So that's why we have to break it up somehow, but we definitely want to get all of the perspectives represented in the work of every subcommittee. Renee, did you have a follow-up thought there? Okay.
No, thank you.
Yeah. So Kimberly, I think I saw you had a question in the chat, which is, would we like nominees or nominations for subcommittee chairs at the same time that people volunteer to serve? I think that's a good idea. Lubna, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great idea.
Great. So when you send Lubna which of the subcommittees you'd like to serve on, if you're also interested in chairing, please nominate yourself or note your interest in being the chair or secretary. I'll keep pushing that really good idea of having secretaries for each subcommittee. Please note that when you volunteer.
Yeah, and for those who are just still feeling overwhelmed by the amount of information about the different subcommittees, like I said, I will send out, a tool to kind of help distinguish between the different subcommittees and maybe help you all make a decision in one or more subcommittees that you would like to participate in. I'll also give some clear instructions on how to sign up, whether that's like a public forum that's open to all task force members to see, or you emailing me directly to share which subcommittee you would like to be on. Also keeping in mind that these are our ideas on how, based on the statute language, we thought it would be best to split up the subcommittees. But if there's any disagreement or other thoughts on how the subcommittee should be structured, we are open to hearing that feedback right now.
Yeah, Mira, go ahead.
I was going to suggest, looking at the equity analysis subcommittee, it's a really large and all-encompassing scope compared with the others that seem more tightly defined. I was going to suggest, even if you don't wind up splitting up those components, which looking through that part of the scope of work, I do agree that it is difficult to split up. I was going to suggest maybe targeting more members for that subcommittee. So perhaps encouraging folks, for example, to volunteer for that subcommittee and maybe like one of the others, instead of funneling more people into subcommittees 2 through 4. So just a thought there, because I would be sort of concerned about the workload associated with subcommittee 1 and potential unequal distribution of labor, and also just distribution of folks to this like very, very important and broad scope of work.
Thanks, Mira. That's a great idea. Ian, go ahead.
This is just more of, I think, a scheduling and process conversation that I think in the spirit of 1266, when subcommittees are scheduled over the next year, we should do our best to try to adhere to some of the standards for participation that were outlined in the law, such as daytime, evening, weekend hours, and doing our best not to schedule at the same time whenever possible, so as to create more opportunity for members to be able to go to other meetings if they so choose. And then I guess I would also ask, would we set up a situation, I know when I was the secretary at City Council, where there were situations where if you were a member of the task force and made a decision to attend a meeting, would you have voting authority there, or would that only be reserved for members of the subcommittee that were determined from the beginning? In the case of City Council, that was reserved for the council president.
Wow, so Ian, that's a great suggestion. First, that we consider scheduling some of the subcommittee meetings in times that are more accessible for community members who work during the day. I think that's something that Lubna can work with you all on, and as we try to schedule specific subcommittee meetings. And I'll also note that if and when we're in person, we also want to make sure we're holding the meetings in disproportionately impacted communities, so that we are getting to Greeley, we're getting to the San Luis Valley, we're getting to Pueblo, we're making sure that we are physically present in the places that we want to be serving. In terms of who can vote, that's a great question. I actually can't remember what we put in the bylaws. I think that we did limit it to formal members of the subcommittee, but that can be something that you all discuss and we can modify, or potentially each subcommittee. So if I'll just hypothetically say that maybe not as many people sign up for the data committee, maybe they want to say that if anyone wants to come to our meeting who isn't formally on the data committee, they can have a vote as a way to try to get more members or something. But it is really up to you all to try to come up with how you want that to work, and we can incorporate that into the bylaws. Uni, I saw you had a question in the chat about which committee will be considering the it's a hard word to pronounce for me, will be considering cumulative impacts. And that's the equity analysis subcommittee. So that's one of the components that the legislature built into the equity analysis part of your mandate of things to consider. Uni, did you have a follow-up question about that, or?
No, I think I was probably going to get into the weeds with my question, so I decided against it. Now, just thinking in terms of, that's like a big question at the national level. How do you determine cumulative impacts? And some of it, boils down to the data that you use and how you weigh that data. And so, is that what you're considering when you're talking about the equity analysis? Or is it in terms of looking at it from, I guess, a policy standpoint, just deciding who will utilize cumulative impact analysis, not so much how it'll be determined? I don't know if that makes sense.
That's a great question. In a way, it's almost how should you conduct one and when should you conduct one, one being a cumulative impacts analysis. I think that the specific language in the Environmental Justice Act about the equity analysis, I think it sort of envisions that a cumulative impacts analysis could be a part of it. So I might just read it out loud for everyone to kind of listen to together. So it tells you that you are supposed to consider recommendations about a potential requirement that agencies prepare an environmental equity analysis for any state action that has the potential to cause negative environmental or public health impacts to a disproportionately impacted community, which analysis could include a process for identifying and describing cumulative impacts to the health and environment of disproportionately impacted communities. That's a lot of words, and I don't know exactly what it means. It's up to you all to figure that out. I think clearly that implicates where cumulative impacts should fit in an equity analysis. But I think to your point, a cumulative impacts analysis really relies on data, and we have to think about the data in the toxicological perspective of how are we combining impacts across media from different sources of pollution, how those interact with what's already physically present in an area. And it's a very complicated question. So I think that the data committee will have to think about cumulative impacts as well, but it's just not specifically called out in the statute as part of the data committee, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you for taking the time to read through that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's why we're here, is to get you all set up to think about what you're doing over the next year. So please ask questions like that. Renee, I saw your comment about enforceable protections. I think, yes, that in a way that's, in my mind, a slightly different component of the equity analysis, which is the component about whether there should be a requirement for agencies to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts, right? Those are kind of the more those are what I would put in the category of enforceable protections. And that's another component that the statute calls out for the equity analysis. Ian, I saw your hand up. Did you have a question?
No, I didn't have a question. I was going to jump in a little bit on just the cumulative part, given the conversation that I was part of with the creation of 1266, but I think you covered it really well.
All right. Any other comments, questions, thoughts about subcommittees? I realized I left something out, which is that there's one topic in the statute in the Environmental Justice Act that we did not assign a subcommittee for, and that is supplemental environmental projects. A supplemental environmental project is when a regulated entity funds a project that benefits a community rather than paying a fine when there's an enforcement action against that entity for violating an environmental law or statute. The Environmental Justice Act does instruct you all to come up with recommendations about whether there should be a requirement for community involvement in all supplemental environmental projects to get community input on what those projects are. Because that's a pretty narrow question, we decided not to give it its own subcommittee, but we will be devoting a part of one of your meetings, potentially, I think maybe the April meeting, to a conversation with the CDPHE environmental staff who work on supplemental environmental projects, as well as potentially input from folks who have been involved in a community-based process around a supplemental environmental project for the Suncor refinery, where there was recently that type of community-based process, so that you can get that information. But our recommendation to you as staff is that because it's a pretty narrow topic, it doesn't need the same attention as the other topics that require a subcommittee. And all of the other topics in the law, we did break out into one or more subcommittees. All right, I don't see a lot of hands up. Lubna, do we want to maybe set a deadline for people to get their subcommittee choices to you?
Yeah, I think January 7th is a good deadline. And so between now and then, this week, I will send out written information about each subcommittee and kind of just put in writing the details that Joel reviewed today. I am just seeing some preliminary direct messages about people saying, I think I want to be the chair of, X, Y, and Z subcommittee. If you have an inkling that you're like leaning towards a subcommittee, feel free to share that with me and I will keep that in mind. And if you just need to wait and have more information and more time to mull it over, that's totally fine too. But just wanted to open it up. If you have some half formulated thoughts, they're welcome.
Go ahead, Beatrice.
Are we thinking the subcommittees will have co-chairs as well, or these will have single chairs and just the broader group will have co-chairs? I just wanted to clarify that.
So for right now, we had thought about co-chairs for the entire task force and then just chairs for each subcommittee. Again, you all determine, the structure that you want to abide by. So we are open to suggestions. If you all want to alter that structure, that is totally fine. So something that we can discuss now. Beatrice, did you have a preference in any direction?
No, I just felt like the arguments for co-chair were valid and I'm very much in favor. So I was just wondering if we wanted to apply the same to the subcommittees, especially the equity analysis committee that's going to have more responsibility, and with people just making sure that there's two people kind of in charge and sharing the weight, and we have both disproportionately impacted communities and government agencies kind of, if we're going for that structure as well, kind of similar. So I would almost weigh in favor if the rest of the group is in favor of that as well.
Do we want to take a informal poll of who would be in favor of co-chairs for the subcommittees? Maybe all in favor of co-chairs for each of the subcommittees, give a thumbs up. Okay, I counted about 7, I think 8. Joel, did you?
I think I got a couple more from folks who used their physical thumbs rather than their virtual thumbs. So yeah, it sounds like it could be a good idea, and maybe since there's not a clear universal yes to that, maybe we can leave it up to the individual subcommittees to decide. Again, each one will be different, and how they want to make decisions, you all should decide based on who you're working with. I agree, Beatrice. I think the equity analysis committee, if it remains intact, could use co-chairs, given its really broad scope. I'm not as sure that, say, the definition subcommittee, needs of disproportionately impacted communities subcommittee needs it in the same way, just given that it's, a little bit narrower in scope. So, and we'll need to be nimble. Lots of things will change quickly for that group as we move from beta testing to finalizing EnviroScreen. So does that sound all right that each subcommittee can kind of revisit that question on its own? I see a lot of nods. I just checked the chat. Jaime had the same suggestion. Sorry, I stole your idea without crediting you, Jaime. And Uni, everyone agrees. Great. Okay. Well, any other comments on the committee structure? Everyone knows their homework to tell Lubna which one you're interested in by January 7th. And I think we can try to get you that write-up and description of each subcommittee as soon as possible so that you have the information to make the decision.
Yeah, the latest you'll have that in your inbox is by the end of the week. Like I said, I will provide that like a handout, a summary, and then I'll also provide you with clear directions about how to sign up, whether that's a public forum or you emailing me directly.
All right, well, I think that's it for my presentation. We remain a little ahead of schedule, which is great. Lubna, the next thing, well, that does actually conclude our kind of substantive business for the day. Lubna, if it makes sense, I don't know if we want to open it up to any other kind of broad comments from task force members before we go into public comment, or you think we should just take a break? I will just share that I appreciate all of you so much for putting up with this full day of process and talking about procedure and how we're going to do our work together and get things done. I know it's not always the most exciting conversation, but it is so wonderful that we've been able to work through this the first day so that we can now launch into the really important substantive work of the task force. So thank you from my perspective.
Yeah, and with that, Joel, I agree. I mean, I think we can open it up for any general questions or comments from the task force. Don't want to start public comment early, as many people, the public may not join until 4 p.m. But any thoughts, questions, concerns from the task force itself? Ian.
I have a public comment question. If there's time remaining and there are people who are present who didn't sign up ahead of time to speak, will they be granted that opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And just so you all know, there was a registration link for folks to sign up for public comment online beforehand. So we have a roster of people who have already signed up, and they'll go in the order in which they signed up. And then any folks throughout the duration of this meeting have also had the opportunity to sign up for public comment. And if there are people that didn't know to sign up or just want to have a comment last minute, they can drop their name in the chat, and we'll open it up to them after we get through that list of names.
Lumna, I'll just go ahead and put the list of names in the chat right now so that any members of the public who are here and aren't sure whether they signed up will know, so that everyone has a good sense. Does that sound okay?
Okay, any other questions or thoughts before we get into public comment? Okay, if there's none, I think we can go ahead and take a break, Joel, and maybe return just before 4 o'clock, just so we're ready to start at 4 on the dot. If that sounds good to everybody, we'll see you back in about 12 minutes. All right, thanks all. All right, it looks like we'll begin our public comment period in just about a minute. Okay, we're at 4 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get our public comment process started. As a reminder, public comments can be provided in either English or in Spanish. Rosario will interpret in either direction. If you do deliver your comment in Spanish, just please pause and give Rosario a moment to switch from the Spanish channel to the English channel to interpret your comment. So there might be just a few seconds of a lag there. Also, when it is someone's turn to give a comment, our meeting host, who is, Natalie, are you now the meeting host? Or is it still Joel?
I think it's still Joel.
Yeah, I am the meeting host, so.
Okay. So once it is your turn to comment for members of the public, Joel will ask you to unmute. You have to select the unmute button on your screen in order to be heard. So just if you have any issues with that, please do reach out to us. Currently, everybody is muted, so until it is your turn to provide public comment, until that time, Joel will have you muted. When it is your turn, he will click unmute, and you have to select unmute on your end as well. All commenters have 3 minutes each. After that 3 minutes, we will have to go on to the next public commenter. Please be mindful of time. There are a number of people who have signed up for public comment, and we want to make sure that we hear from everybody over the course of this next hour. The task force can also receive written comments at any time. Written comments can be emailed to cdphe.ej@state.co.us with the words task force, or in the case of Spanish, Grupo de Acción in the subject line. And Natalie will put that information into the chat about who to email written comment to if you all do not have the opportunity to share your comments today. As I mentioned, we asked people who wanted to provide public comment to register in advance. If we make it through the list of people who signed up in advance before 5, we will allow people who did not register to provide comments. At that point, we will ask anyone who would like to provide a comment to raise their hand in the Zoom, and we will call on you in the order that you raised your hand. You can see that the list of names of folks who signed up for public comment is in the chat. We are starting off with Shayna Oliver. Joel, if you could go ahead and unmute Shayna.
Does not appear that Shayna is in the meeting.
Okay. And I'm actually trying to get this clock to work as well. I might have to exit this PowerPoint. Sorry, just 1 second. I don't believe this downloaded correctly from the Google Slides.
Thank you, Lumna. And while you're doing that, I believe the first person who signed up for comment, whose name I do see in the chat, is Darcy Martinez. However, if Shayna Oliver, Jerry Otero, Alejandro Murillo, or Lupita Cardoza are here, please raise your hand. I don't see anyone with that name in the Zoom, but if any of you are here, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we will go to Darcy.
Okay. Darcy, are you there and are you unmuted?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. And go ahead and provide your public comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys for allowing me to talk with you today. I just give you many blessings on this journey. I think it's amazing that you have the opportunity to do this for our communities. My name is Darcy Martinez. I am a doctor of nursing practice. I'm also the president of the National Association of Hispanic Nurses, the Denver chapter. I am a member of the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. I am a family nurse practitioner in Commerce City, and I also live in Commerce City, which I adore and work very hard for that community. I also care for 3 asthmatics in my family. One is a child, and I did lose my father to work-related respiratory failure, exposure to asbestos. So respiratory has been something that I've always worked on as a nurse. I've been a nurse for over 15 years. The last 2 summers have been really difficult. Where COVID and extreme heat and air pollution collided kept us respiratory nurses very, very busy. And we anticipate another extreme summer. So just wanted to let you know that the nurses support this task force, especially the groups I belong to. We don't want to see a summer like we've seen before. We've seen families miss work, miss school, just unable to thrive because of their exposure to air pollution and eliciting exacerbations of either their asthma or COPD. So we've been just really busy, and I asked the task force to really just be bold and be swift. I feel like healthcare is in a code red zone. We need help now, and we need things to change for families so that they could thrive. We know our patients, we know how they live, where they live, we know where they work. And so we have come up with blueprints and strategies for immediate action to make sure that our most vulnerable can survive and could survive the effects of climate change, which we're bound to face this summer. I just want to wish you guys luck and let us know if you need any help. Again, if that's the Hispanic Nurses Association or the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. We would be happy to share our resources, our research, the science of how we work with communities, especially with respiratory issues. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Darcy. And thank you for your public comment and all of your thoughtful considerations. Much appreciated. All right.
I believe up next we have Karen Speed. Karen, I've asked you to unmute.
Am unmuted. Thank you, Joel. I plan on speaking more directly today on the issues of Suncor and Commerce City, as that is clearly an encroachment on the health and well-being of minority citizens. Or maybe to speak on the debacle of having oil and gas wells closely built behind Greeley's Bella Romero School, where it's over 90% Hispanic and Black students, after that project was rejected by parents at Frontier Academy, which was 77% white students. Clearly racial injustice. However, in the last few weeks here in Windsor, it seems that the industry continues to overstep into damaging the local environment. On September 6th, Great Western had a spill on their rain dance pad that is built adjacent to a FEMA floodplain next to the Cache la Poudre River. To date, the bike path has been relocated twice to accommodate their well pad spacing. On September 28th, Extraction Oil and Gas had a spill on the milkshake pad that is also adjacent to the Rain Dance neighborhood in Windsor and very close to homes. This pad has a history of spills and at least one explosion that injured workers and took a couple of them to the hospital. And just a few days ago, on December 12th, Extraction's Merlin well pad, also adjacent to that neighborhood and close to the Poudre River bike trail, reported a fluid spill which soaked into the ground. This spill will require excavation of the impacted soil as it occurred in an unlined containment space for the separators that caused that spill. Ongoing chemical analysis of soils will be mandatory to follow up on the extent of contamination. Unfortunately, this particular pad also received a special exception on its setback by the town of Windsor to allow that pad to be set only 290 feet from a home. The Rain Dance neighborhood should have about 3,000 homes when completed. In addition to that, a new elementary school is to be built in that neighborhood, which will also be in close proximity to oil and gas wells. There are 5 active well pads that are within the borders of that development, and all 5 have documented spills, with 3 having had explosions on site. Keep in mind that 4 years ago, this Wednesday, December 23rd, one of Extraction Stromberger wells exploded in Windsor. That impact concussion was felt at our home, and we are located almost 4 miles away. That event required 10 fire departments for response. Based on extensive independent testing performed this past January, that area is highly contaminated with above acceptable levels of PFAS and no plan to clean it up. Stromberger is also in a FEMA floodplain. It is too late for this area, but we should learn, and you guys have the absolute wonderful opportunity to create and continue looking at these things and to not allow such irresponsible development that leads to blending oil and gas with the development of homes, a beloved river, people, fish, recreational areas, and hiking. And that's all. Thank you. And good luck. I really support you guys, and I'm so proud. And I see some familiar faces on there that I know personally are fabulous. So good job on that.
Thank you so much for your comment, Karen. Also, just a verbal reminder to please speak slowly for our interpreter.
Alumni, I believe our next commenter is John Bryant. I do not see him in the chat. So John, if you are here, please raise your hand. And in the meantime, we will move on to the next commenter, which is Velma Campbell. Dr. Campbell, I just asked you to unmute, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Excuse me. I want to appreciate at first the opportunity to speak to this landmark first meeting of the Environmental Justice Task Force. My name is Velma Campbell. I'm an MD, MPH in Environmental Health Sciences, and I practice occupational and environmental medicine in Pueblo, Colorado, which, as you have heard, is an environmental justice community. Environmental justice in the regulatory work of CDPHE requires elevating and bringing to the forefront those processes, the voices of disproportionately impacted community members who have too long borne the burden of pollution and failures of regulation. I have heard calls from some today for science-based recommendations from this task force, and would say in that regard that there is extensive, vast, and growing scientific documentation of the adverse effects of pollution on human health, including the coming generations. That literature needs the voice of impacted communities for reality and power in the regulatory process. This task force is an important step, including elements such as equity analysis, restorative justice, and multidimensional aspects critical to inclusivity for these communities. It is also critical to the task force that credibility of the task force and its effectiveness, that we not be confused between the identity of disproportionately impacted communities defined in the House Bill 21-1266 and the mandated representation of agencies and industries on this task force. The regulated industries and regulatory agencies clearly are not disproportionately impacted communities and should not be regarded as such. As a public health specialist, I recognize the importance of science and data in policy. It is vital to recognize that an aspect of environmental justice is that often data collection has not been done by design too often, and the response to communities is that there is no data. These communities must be acknowledged as sources of experiential, often measured data that needs to be heard in the regulatory processes, and I hope the task force will recommend mechanisms for this to happen at early stages. I would encourage continued use of Zoom or some similar mechanism throughout the work of the task force as a key element in inclusivity and equity for members of the public, especially the impacted community members who may not be able to travel. Thank you again for this opportunity, and please feel free to call on me anytime I can be of assistance.
Thank you so much, Karen.
All right. Next up, we have Sharon Montes. I do not believe that I see Ms. Montes in the chat. So next is JD Roybal. I also do not see Mr. Roybal in the chat. If either of you are here, please raise your hand and we'll get back to you. So that means that the next commenter is Therese Gilbert, or Teresa Gilbert. I apologize if I mispronounced that. So Ms. Gilbert, please go ahead and start your comment.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to speak. I am a teacher up here in Greeley, and if it weren't for my break right now, I wouldn't be able to share my comments, so I do appreciate this. It's been about 10 years to the month that fracking began right close to schools, planned places, when I attended a school board meeting in December of 2011. And there had oil men had gotten on the school board, though they did not have children in the schools, and they were approving well sites at 13 schools. I was alerted at this point, became a founding member of Welder and Water, and in our time from 2012 to 2016, we would try to just do triage. We were just trying to keep these wells from behind schools, let alone right in people's backyards. We were successful with a couple producers by working with them directly to have wells moved from right beyond a school to a further location. And in the case of Frontier Academy, it has been mentioned, those wells were moved from that school. It was a charter school in the center of town to Bella Romero. And we all know that what really mattered with the producer was they bought property 400 feet into the county. And the rules they knew would be, the process would be rubber stamped by the Weld County Commissioners, and it would go through, sail through with very little comment or conflict. We had such hopes with 181, but this situation would change, and it hasn't changed. It has not changed significantly at all. The industry continues to get variances, continues to get a workaround. And as we saw in the news last week, benzene levels are at a real health. It's endangering our health here in Weld County. The only assurance I've ever heard from a producer is, oh, don't worry, it blows out of Weld. Well, yes, it blows out of Weld, and then all these pollutants and toxics are resting against the foothills in Fort Collins. So I guess we're tired of fighting this up here, and we've just been lied to pretty much for about a decade, and 181 hasn't helped the situation. I look forward to the possibility that this group might actually do something about the wells that are getting people sick up here in Weld County. And as a 29-year teacher in this district, I could give you hours of anecdotes from nurses who see nosebleeds that they can't account for and headaches and so on. But thank you again for this time. And I wish you the best, and let's really try to make something happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese, and thank you for sharing your story and your perspective. It's much appreciated.
Next up, we have Patricia Garcia Nelson. Patricia, please go ahead and start your comment.
I really feel that it's important to provide feedback at the very beginning of this process, since this is a completely new task force. And I've been working with some of you guys for years at this point. But I really feel like I know that I want to try to say this in the most productive way possible. I really feel that the conversations that were happening today were really good and productive conversations. But I really feel that it's important to mention things at the very beginning that we can address at the beginning, instead of having to come and circle around things. You know, just specifically about the makeup of the task force. The only reason that I was able to log in was because I'm working from home right now. And so, you know, this task force is created to be, you know, really the representation of the communities most impacted. And so I think it's really important to think about that when scheduling all these meetings and things like that. And I also really want to provide some more in-depth feedback about how to about ways to disperse information in communities like mine that are most impacted in a manner that is going to be easy to understand and digest, simply because, you know, I'm a native Spanish speaker. I have experience, you know, getting information out to my community because, you know, the reality is I've had to take it upon myself to get the information out to my community because it was simply not available in any other language other than Spanish. And I really think that at this point, you know, because we've come this far and we've had to create a whole task force to address all these issues, we can no longer just accept the bare minimum. And I want to say in the nicest way possible that we are no longer going to accept the bare minimum. Like I said, I would love to provide some more feedback and recommendations that I see in ways that we can improve the communication of information to communities like mine, and really emphasize that, you know, we need to focus on getting this information out to as many people as possible. And, you know, trying just to focus on Spanish is a good step, but it can't be the only step, because I know a lot of different agencies across the state love to talk about the diversity that we have in our state, but there is no communication to other communities. And like I said, I really appreciate the efforts going into this. But, you know, if we're going to do this, we have to do this right. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And your concerns and your voice are definitely being heard, and we welcome your continued feedback. For those that didn't catch this before, but please keep in mind that we do welcome written public comment as well, and you can email us at cdphe_ej@state.co.us. That email address is in the chat. And so we welcome your continued feedback throughout this process that we're engaging the task force. All right. Joel, do we know who is next in our lineup?
We have actually made it through the full list of people who signed up for a comment. So maybe we could open it up if a member of the public who did not sign up is here and call on them. I see one member of the public with a hand up, but Tricia, as a task force member, did you have something you meant to say right now as well?
Well, I just noticed that somebody who had signed up for comment and wasn't here when you called their name was in the waiting room. So I don't know if you just allowed Ms. Montez in.
Thank you. I had missed that. I apologize. Ms. Montez, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I apologize that we missed you in the waiting room for a moment. It is your turn to provide comment if you are ready and interested in providing us a comment. We have 3 minutes. You may provide the comment in English or Spanish.
Thank you. So I'm actually a physician based out of Loveland, Colorado. So I've been in and out of the meeting as I've been doing clinical care. So thank you. Briefly, I am here today on behalf of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Colorado chapter. I am the chair-elect and really honor what I've been seeing happening in this task force and really celebrate the diversity and the mission for creating a more healthy, just, and peaceful world for present and future generations. We personally, professionally, and as the chair, we support the efforts of the task force to increase protection for communities that are experiencing the negative health impacts. And we also are aligned with supporting mitigating the disproportionate impacts that are happening on low-income communities. That includes the lack of trees, the indoor cooling systems, heat islands, substandard housing, and access to healthy food, all woven. That the qualities of stewardship for personal people health are exactly the same as the qualities that are required for stewardship of a healthy planet. Same principles, same mental and action. So I bring to this 30 years as a family physician who has a background in environmental biology and who's cared for people in community health centers and seen the lung infections, the hormone disruption, and really once again bring it back to speaking for Physicians for Responsibility, social responsibility, which is amazing group of scientists, healthcare workers, public health officials, all committed to working together as part of what is required in these times for future generations. So thank you.
Thank you for your public comment, Ms. Montez. Are there any others that we are seeing from those who have registered? And if not, we can go to those who have their hand raised. I see Patty has her hand raised. Any others, Joel or Natalie, that we're seeing that had already registered before?
I do not see anyone else who had pre-registered, so I think we can move on to Patricia Iwasaki was the first hand that I saw up. So Patricia, I believe you have the ability to speak now.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you who have tremendous patience and wherewithal to go through an 8-hour meeting. I especially want to acknowledge the public comments because they were very moving and also very on point. I just simply wanted to make a suggestion. I work with the CAREJ, which is a advisory committee for the city of Denver for the climate action, sustainability, and resilience, that perhaps one of your subgroups, which was, I believe, best practices for community engagement, could entertain also being a committee that will discuss innovations, particularly in disproportionately impacted communities, since the process of best practices may sort out some newer innovations that are happening in other places around the country that are really making a difference in terms of communities. And I think it behooves this committee to be as forward-looking and innovative in things that might have been effective in other areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patty. Any others that would like to provide public comment at this time, please do raise your hand. Ian, I see your hand raised, please. Go ahead.
I'm actually just curious if it's possible for staff to send an email with the link to the people who are signed up now, letting them know this is something we've encountered a lot with regulatory proceedings, where we've seen meetings that take place during working hours for disproportionately impacted communities closing early while people are trying to balance picking up their kids. And I also guess I would love to gauge the interest in our members for at least this meeting, if you would be open to being present for the next 30 minutes in case those individuals decide to come forward if the staff emails them.
Ian, I think that maybe while Lumna provides some closing comments, I could send an email to the folks who registered but were not here. I'll note that one of them, Mr. Roybal, actually emailed me shortly after I called his name to say that he was not available, but I can send that out to the rest of the folks who registered but were not here.
Yeah, great suggestion. Thanks, Ian, for that. Okay.
I just do want to acknowledge that, you know, we have been in this meeting all day, and I recognize that many folks, you know, are in their final stretch. So I will just provide a few closing remarks, and hopefully those who are able to stay until 5 p.m. can continue to stay on. So first and foremost, thank you to everyone who provided public comment thus far. We really appreciate your perspectives and your feedback, and encourage you to do so and continue providing public comment throughout this year as we're going through this process of developing an environmental justice strategy and a plan for the state of Colorado. Thank you to all of our task force members for staying engaged during the duration of this meeting and for your dedication to achieving environmental justice in our beautiful state. I recognize that staying engaged all day from 9 to 5 can be really challenging at times, especially when we're all virtual over Zoom. Really appreciate the level of engagement that I saw today. A lot of great questions were asked, a lot of great conversations. I do want to continue to encourage all of our task force members to, you know, have this be an informal place where we can really have open conversations and productive conversations with one another. And when I say informal, of course, always remaining respectful, but informal in the sense of, you know, pushing past the formalities and really digging into the work. And thank you for staying on video. I feel like a lot of people tried really hard to keep their videos on, and I know that can be very challenging, but you know, not only does that express engagement, it's not really important as much for our staff as it is for members of the public to see you actively listening and to see your face and your reactions when people are speaking. That really speaks volumes. I want to take a moment to thank our Environmental Justice Unit staff, Joel and Natalie, for helping with all of our meeting logistics and technology. Many of you are part of different boards and commissions and have taken part in meetings like this. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that happens to get everything organized and to ensure the meeting is running smoothly. So thank you so much for all of your hard work. And Thank you especially to our translation and interpretation specialist, Rosario. She has been interpreting the entire meeting since 9 a.m. this morning. That is a very, very heavy lift to keep up. And thank you for continuing to interpret even as people were speaking quickly. For some of you who might have just switched to the Spanish channel like myself, seeing her keep up with people talking through technical terms and talking very quickly was very, very impressive. So thank you so much for staying steadfast with that. Okay, so that takes us into kind of some next steps. I will be following up with all of you as promised with more information about the subcommittees, getting all of that information in writing about exactly what the subcommittees are, the different topics that within each subcommittee we are expected to discuss, the frequency with which we might meet, and who would be facilitating those subcommittee meetings. I will get that to you by the end of the week, by Friday the latest. So you will have an opportunity to sign up and provide your feedback by January 7th. Our next full task force meeting will take place in February. The date is to be determined. As you all saw, I know there wasn't a lot of time for you to turn around and get responses back to me, but I did ask of all of you to please share any dates that do not work for you between now and November. We are trying really hard to ensure that we hold these meetings at a time that really where everybody can attend, all 27 members. Everybody's voice really does matter. And so even for one member to miss a meeting, we could be missing critical perspectives. Again, each of you were handpicked, you were appointed for a reason. And so we really want all of you to participate in every single meeting. If you have not sent me your availability, I know that many people already have, but if you have not sent me your availability, actually your non-availability between now and November, please do that at your earliest convenience. As soon as I get that information from each of you, then I can set some dates and set the calendar for the remainder of the year, which I think having those now will be really helpful for everybody. Okay, so in the time that I've been speaking, I just wanted to check in to see if there are any folks, any new folks that have joined that may want to provide public comment at this time. Or any task force members that would like to share out on anything that we've discussed so far.
Lubna, I'll just share that I did email Sheena Oliver, Jerry Otero, Alejandro Murillo, Lupita Cardoza, and John Bryant while you were speaking to let them know that the comment window was closing in a few minutes.
Yeah, Tyson.
I just wanted to thank you as well. I know you thanked everybody else on the staff, but thank you for putting this together. It was a heck of a feat just to get 27 people onto one meeting for the first meeting. I do not envy you for getting everybody together for the rest of the year, but I do appreciate all the efforts that you've done to coordinate with not only us, but the public as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyson. I appreciate that. All right, I do want to acknowledge Ian's comment about, folks might be leaving work and, trying to make this comment period. So I think we will leave the Zoom active until 4 p.m. If folks need to kind of multitask and check their emails while we wait for members of the public to come on board. And I will leave in the chat if there is somebody that does want to provide public comment I'll leave clear instructions so they're not kind of weirded out by the silence that is about to happen. For anybody that does need to hop off, I do encourage all of our task force members to stay on until 5 p.m. Anybody that is in dire need, I understand that some people are staying here and they have kids and there's childcare might be an issue. For those that do need to hop off, please have a wonderful rest of the week and happy holidays. We will be remaining on until 5 p.m. But if folks need to multitask until then, feel free. I just noticed we had a couple more members of the public join. If you're joining now, feel free to raise your hand if you are interested in providing public comment, and we can unmute you. Okay, Kate Christensen, I see has her hand raised. Kate, would you like to provide public comment?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. If members of the task force can hear, if you could just indicate that you were there by turning your camera back on, that would be much appreciated. All right, it looks like we have many of us here. So Kate, just as a heads up, some people may be off camera, but I think everybody is at their desk. So go ahead and provide public comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for taking the time to hear my public comments today. My name is Kate Christensen. I live in Lafayette, Colorado. One thing that I'm concerned about is the general accessibility of these sort of public comments. I am cleaning my kitchen. I just got off of work. I'm doing childcare. It's a challenge, but I do appreciate you letting me give comment. The other thing is, since we're talking about environmental justice in general, and this is bigger than the Environmental Justice Task Force, but I feel like it's a really important thing to consider. Those of us who care about the environment and climate are being torn to shreds by all the piecemeal stuff that's happening at the state level. Like the financial assurances rulemaking at the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission has been going on since April. The oil and gas rulemaking at the AQCC is currently going on. We've been participating in the Suncor Title V permits to pollute. There's also Suncor water. There's so much happening at the Cherokee plant in Pueblo, and to really make things equitable, we need some sort of easy clearinghouse so that we can access all the variety of things we care about, and someone at the state level is paying attention to all of it. No one is meaningfully looking at cumulative impacts, even though they're supposed to be. For example, like the Oil and Gas Commission will hear and approve permits without taking Suncor into account in Adams County, for example. Suncor is not really in the purview of the COGCC, but the pollution from Suncor and the pollution from all those Adams County Adams County oil and gas drilling, that all impacts already disproportionately impacted communities, and no one is looking at it holistically, even though there's legislatively they're supposed to be doing that. So I guess that's my biggest concern when it comes to environmental justice, the accessibility, but also the broader piece of how are we supposed to access all these things, and who is taking every single emission into account, and how it impacts these already disproportionately impacted communities. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Sorry about the white stripes in the background. That's my kids.
No worries at all, Kate. And yes, thank you for sharing that with us. We do recognize that this timing doesn't work for everyone, and really happy that you were able to join us and get in your public comment before 5 p.m. All right, I see Brian Loma has their hand raised. Brian, would you like to provide public comment at this time?
Good afternoon. Thank you. I do apologize. Calling on the go here. So I'll start. My name is Brian Loma. I'm a almost nearly 10-year resident of Denver, Colorado. My grandfather was a native of Colorado, and I'm an environmental activist in the community. I'm concerned about how we process responsibility for our consumption practices, how we process manufacturing responsibility in the things that we purchase, the things that we consume, the things that we produce here in the state, and how that equates to humans on a wide variety of levels. One of the things that stuck out in my attention to the details in the last decade that I've lived here is that between the Colorado State Capitol and Denver City Hall, there are 6 water fountains that were installed sometime in the last 100 or so years. One of them honors Emily Griffiths and her work, and none of them have functioned. The access to water, bathrooms, how that impacts the waste streams of our extended metro area is something that's highly concerning to me. But also, as an electioneer here in the state of Colorado, working with others, we just put a ballot measure on in the city and county of Denver for 2022 to require recycling and composting, not just at houses, but apartments and condos and music festivals. And I grew up in a state where recycling was the law. And I can't believe that it's 2021 and this isn't a conversation we're having at the state level. When we look at access to basic services in our communities, those who have waste management at their residencies, it's not equal, and it's not a platform that's equitable to all and transferable, so that when people move from county to county or city to city, even within the state, that the system works the same way, so that it works. Just like my father's learning of the English language through grade school and the U.S. education system taught my my immigrant great grandparents and extended family, as well as others in the community, how to reach the English language and to be able to speak that. The language of environmental justice and responsibility is something that has to be so simple that we can all get a grasp on it, meaning that children should know the difference between trash and not trash, a recycling bin, because it's everywhere. These are real big issues that we see, and as our growing metropolitan communities are experiencing greater issues of financial instability, of the ability to maintain housing or transportation access. We don't see equity in the planning of things like our roadways, where there's mass transit every time we extend a mass transport pathway. A road from Colorado Springs to Pueblo to Denver to Boulder doesn't have a train track or a bus line that continuously runs as the automobiles do. And as we extend that to thinking about where the charging stations are and the fuel up spots are, these are catastrophic issues that planning for the future means that we have to take drastic steps now. And so I'm really concerned about these things, and I thank you for putting it on the record.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comment. We have a couple minutes left. Are there any others that are waiting to provide public comment? If so, please raise your hand at this time. All right. Thank you so much to all who provided public comment. For fairness, we do want to limit our comments to 3 minutes. And Brian, thank you for sharing. Okay, so this is taking us to the end of the hour. That said, we will wrap up our meeting. As I mentioned before, if you could please share your bios and headshots with me to put on the CDPHE EJ unit website as well as your non-availability between now and November. A number of you have emailed me during this meeting. For those that haven't, if you could please just spend a few minutes after this meeting and share that information with me, that will go a long way. I would like to motion to adjourn. Are there folks in the task force that can agree with that?
Second that.
I got a second.
Second.
All right. Thank you again, everybody, for taking the time from 9 to 5. We are at 5 p.m. I appreciate your engagement so much. We consider this a very successful first meeting, hoping to continue to have many more productive meetings moving forward. This was honestly the meeting just to lay the groundwork, and so the work begins now. So thanks a lot, and I will be in touch via email regarding the future subcommittee dates and the February meeting date. Thank you all.